Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. It was raining cats and dogs in our green leafy neighbourhood in Philadelphia, where I lived in a semi-detached house with my husband Mark and my two children Eloise and Curtis, who were both in their early teens, and did I not know it? It would seem all the bad press about teenagers is definitely true. They can be opinionated, lazy, slothful, moody, cantankerous, and capriciously belligerent. They write books like What to Expect When You're Expecting, for mothers who are embarking on a journey of bringing a baby into this world. But I haven't seen any books available on how to deal with the irksome challenges of raising a pair of unbridled teenagers, much like my own. Believe me, some of us mothers could do with a book like that, to help us ride the tempestuous roller coaster of dealing with a pair of precocious brats. I mean, what had happened to my two sweet children, with their adorable angelic faces, whom at one stage had been agreeable, so sweet, so considerate. It seemed only like yesterday that they were still in diapers. Where had the time got to? It had been swallowed up so fast. These days Eloise, my daughter, who'd once been the cutest little cherub, and I don't say that lightly, she really was once upon a time, not any more. She had a mouth on her like a dirty sewer at times. We didn't raise our children to swear like this, but these offensive words my daughter sometimes employed had never ever been uttered under our roof before. Were the kids at school encouraging each other to speak like this? Let's just say me and many of the other mothers from my children's school would often get together to commiserate, although we would never admit that this is what we were actually doing. But let's not kid, you need a hell of a lot of Dutch courage when raising teenagers. I believe our quaint little coffee mornings were the quintessential opportunity for the mothers to air their grievances. It would give me much relief to know that my two children were not exceptional in their outrageous behaviour. It went with the territory of having teenagers. More often than not, the mothers kept repeating the same mantra. This is only a phrase. I think we told ourselves this over and over again, as a self-soothing reassurance that there was indeed a light at the end of the dark tunnel, even if it seemed a long way in coming. Soon our kids would ultimately grow up. We'd get our sweet children back, only they'd be all grown up, but the cantankerous juvenile stormy outbursts would likely be a thing of the past. I remember when I brought home our puppy for the very first time, a little rambunctious Jack Russell called Rochester, who got his teeth in absolutely everything: sandals, shoes, clothes, cushions, toys, and on occasion, I regret to say, even my hair, which he pulled unrepentantly hard with his teeth. It was an exasperating time for the family, me most especially, as I didn't take kindly to returning home after a grocery shop to discover half my sofa had been torn into shreds by Rochester. Who knew that anything quite so small could be capable of doing so much damage? There was foam all over my living room floor, and a little dog who stared back at me through innocent black eyes, with a "I didn't do it" look on his face. "What are you looking at me for?" "Did you do this, Rochester?" I said, pointing at the sofa and the foam strewn magnanimously over the floor. That little brazen terrier proceeded to trot over to me, sit down in front of me, and look at me rather bashfully, with a very innocent bravado, as if to say, "Are you crazy? It wasn't me that did this to your sofa. It was the cat over there." Our tortoiseshell cat, Sheila, was lying fast asleep on the other couch. She looked up at me gingerly through her green eyes, as if to say, "This is your fault. You brought that wrecking ball into our lives, and now our sofas are being torn apart, and my perching spot has been completely dismantled." I was duly informed by our vet that it was just a phrase. After 6 months my puppy would grow out of this excessive chewing, and believe it or not, he did. Rochester had grown into a fun-loving, affectionate family dog, and his days of chewing anything beyond a bone or a doggy treat were long behind him. Thank God! However, the phrase I was going through with my teenagers was an altogether different matter. It was not just a brief 6-month affair. That I could possibly deal with. This was much more insufferable, and I knew if I didn't dye my hair auburn at the hairdresser's, it would be completely grey by now. My children were responsible for doing this to me. Should a woman in her early 40s be going grey already? I didn't think so. But children can take a remarkable toll on you both emotionally and physically, and grey hair is one of the inevitable side effects of stress. Stress brought on from raising teenagers. My son Curtis was 16 years old. He was the most responsible of my 2 children, not given to temper tantrums and angry outbursts, so typical of his sister Eloise. He was much quieter than her. For a teenager, he was far more composed. Indeed, some of the other mothers envied me for having such a self-assured, polite gentleman for a son. But they didn't know that there was a dark side to Curtis, a side that I'd probably tried to hide from myself more than anybody else. I think I thought if I pretended it wasn't there, it would go away, or that my son would grow out of such antisocial behaviour. Ostensibly, deep down, I knew the secret issue was never really going to fully be brushed under the carpet. My son was not quite right in the head, and that was hard to have to admit to myself. Let's not kid. Every out-of-control wildfire started up from just one little teeny-weeny spark. It might appear innocent at first, but if that tamed fire is left to its own devices to become intemperate and uninhibited, all hell will ultimately break loose. Was I sitting on a potential landmine with my son Curtis that would come back to bite me sometime in the not-too-distant future? Indeed, I had so many gut-wrenching reservations about my son that I sent him to a child psychologist, as some of the irrationally impulsive things he would invariably do disturbed me greatly. One day when Curtis was 5, his sister only 4, all my daughter's little dolls went walkabout. Eloise was desperately upset. We searched everywhere for her dolls, but all 6 of them had mysteriously vanished. I mean, how does that happen? I don't mind admitting I was completely nonplussed. I asked my little 5-year-old son Curtis if he knew where his sister's dolls were. He looked at me through his butter-wouldn't-melt chocolate-colour eyes and said, "Nay, what would I want with her dolls? Dolls are sissy, and I don't like dolls." If I hadn't known any better, I'd have sworn there was a child ghost in our house with a penchant for stealing dolls. In order to calm the rising turbulent storm in our home, with my daughter distressed about her missing dolls, I did what any self-respecting mother would invariably do in the circumstances to cover over the cracks of discord, to bring peace back to the Hannon household. I bought Eloise a brand new doll, better than all the other dolls I'd purchased before. I thought that would compensate for the loss of her 6 missing dolls. I knew it would make little Eloise terribly happy. When I brought that doll home, Eloise's eyes lit up like a Christmas tree, and wherever she went, Phoebe the doll came with her. I think she was terribly afraid her doll would enigmatically go walkabout again, like all the other dolls had done before. One day when I was in the kitchen, I saw my 5-year-old son Curtis was behaving furtively. Every mother instinctively knows when their kid is up to no good. Curtis had sneakily slipped into the yard and was looking around to make sure no one had seen him. I happened to be at the sink, washing dishes, and the window at the sink overlooked the yard. My daughter was in the kitchen playing with some Lego blocks with her brother. Well, so I thought. But Curtis had craftily, rather covertly, managed to slip out of the kitchen without being noticed. Granted, the back kitchen door was slightly ajar, so I should have been a wee bit more vigilant when minding my kids. But as any hard-working, fatigued mother will tell you, sometimes you need eyes in the back of your head when watching over your impish little young ones. I watched my son suspiciously tot over towards the end of the yard, and he was carrying something long in his hands. What the hell was he doing, I wondered. I realised to my horror it was Eloise's doll. Are you kidding me? I stood there unable to believe what I was seeing. I wiped my wet hands on a drying cloth, surreptitiously closed the kitchen door behind me, and clandestinely moved over the manicured turf of the yard towards my son, who seemed to be digging up the soil under the old oak tree vigorously with his little hands, which explained to me why his nails were so often caked with dirt. I watched him for a little while, hiding behind a large rose bush, and I dashed over to him when I realised my son was burying my daughter's doll, Phoebe. "Curtis, what are you doing?" I asked, retrieving Eloise's doll from him and brushing away the dirt from the doll's pristine dresses. "I'm killing the doll! I'm killing the doll! The doll is naughty," he told me proudly. "This is her grave. She's got to die. She's got to die. She's been a bad doll." In that moment, my blood went cold, and chills of dread ran down my spine. Was I overreacting? I didn't think so. I wondered in that moment if I was raising a boy who would grow up to become a serial killer. I know that sounds dramatic, but I'm not going to sugarcoat things for you. I remember pulling my son away from this little sandpit under the oak tree, and I began digging up the soil, and sure enough, there was a large graveyard of my daughter's 6 dolls, all buried under that tree. I wanted to scream at my son furiously, smack him across the bum so hard, but I did neither of these things. In truth, I was so confounded, deeply disturbed, numb with shock. I couldn't even talk about the discomposing incident with my husband for a long while. I was so troubled, it was taking a long time to process. Finally, when I did get round to telling him what had happened, he laughed at me and said, "Kids will be kids, Claudia. For goodness sake, you're reading far too much into this. Our son is a perfectly normal, well-rounded young 5-year-old boy. You're worrying about nothing." "Mark," I said, "our son buried all his sister's dolls under the oak tree. Don't you think that's weird behaviour? He told me he had killed them, and the dolls were being buried because they had misbehaved, so they deserved to die. And this was their grave. He's 5 years old, for God's sake. What 5-year-old kid talks like this? I'm sorry, Mark, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what Curtis might one day become. He's talking about killing dolls in the very same breath he uses when he's playing with his toy train. I'm sorry, it's not normal. He was so nonchalant, so indifferent. We could end up parents on the news when our kid's a teenager, responsible for shooting his classmates." I burst into inconsolable tears, and my husband had cradled me lovingly in his arms, wiping the wisps of my long blonde hair away tenderly from my face. "Claudia! I can't believe you're punishing yourself like this, Claudia, with your absurd, far-fetched ideas. You've got quite the fertile imagination on you. Our son is not going to be a teenage Freddy Krueger." I wanted to believe my husband. Really I did. This was only the beginning. After that rather discomposing incident, I kept my eyes firmly pinned on my son, like a vulture over a decaying carcass. I couldn't let him out of my sight. One day at kindergarten, a young girl called Annie Matuggerson complained that Curtis had pushed her into a little paddling pool. Apparently she'd been standing outside one of those big paddling pools made from canvas, filled with water from the garden hose. And the next thing she knew, after a large push, she was plunged into the shallow water. She came out of the water soaked to the skin. Her pretty little flowery dress was drenched. She was crying her little eyes out. Luckily the paddling pool was shallow, so she wouldn't have drowned, but Annie undoubtedly had had quite the shock. When the kindergarten teacher asked her what had happened, she told the teacher that Curtis had pushed her into the water. No one had seen the rather unsettling event, so there were no eyewitnesses. I gather when Curtis was asked about the incident, he looked as innocent as a doe. Indeed, my son looked like an adorable little unblemished, perfect cherub, like he always did. He was such a sweet child. It was impossible to believe he was capable of being mean. Of course, he had the kindergarten teacher wrapped around his little finger. At 5 years old, and she didn't even know it. That was the irony of ironies.
Miss Parker, I never pushed Annie into the water,
he told the naively gullible kindergarten teacher.
But I saw Freddie doing it. I don't want to tell Porcupines, but Mrs. Parker, I know what I saw. Freddie is a very naughty boy, Miss Parker. He's a bad boy. He was being very horrible to Annie. His daddy should give him a big smack when he gets back home, and he shouldn't be allowed to eat ice cream forever and ever. Amen.
The teacher believed my son because he seemed so credible and very observant for one so young. Freddie was a mischievous boy in the class who was always pranking the other kids, but there was nothing remotely insidious about him. When he was blamed for the mischievous incident, despite his impassioned protests, everyone believed he was entirely responsible.
I did not push Annie into the water, Miss Parker. I promise you I didn't do it. But why is Curtis lying? He's telling you lies. Because I think he did it, Miss Parker,
he told the doubtful teacher. Now don't you go lying to me, Freddie. You know that it's very bad to lie. Eddie responded with great conviction.
But I didn't do it, Miss Parker. I didn't do it. I am not lying. Why won't anybody believe me? It's not fair.
When I learnt of the cheeky incident, I knew my artful son was entirely responsible for pushing little Annie into the paddling pool. I just knew it. I took him to one side when we were at home and I said, Curtis, why did you push little Annie into the paddling pool? I know it was you. Now don't you lie to me. He looked up at me through his chocolate brown eyes and said quite nonchalantly,
It felt good to upset her, Mummy, 'cause she's a crybaby. She's always crying. She was so scared and wet all over. It was really funny. And Freddie got into lots of trouble. It served him right. He stole one of my chocolate chip cookies when I wasn't looking, but I know it was him.
It was in that moment I knew Curtis was trouble. I was seriously wondering if he'd grow up to be a monster like Jeffrey Dahmer. People are so often quick to point the condemning finger at parents who have raised kids that ended up being serial killers. Most will believe that the child was brought up in an unstable, dysfunctional family, where he or she was abused. But sometimes that is not the case. It certainly wasn't Curtis's situation. My son was raised in a perfectly loving environment in a middle-class family home, where his mother stayed at home to take care of him, and his father brought home a decent income. And my son wanted for nothing. And as for love, he was completely swaddled in it. The final straw ultimately came when my son did something so unmentionable that I'm embarrassed to actually talk about it. There were some things Curtis did when he was young that were a screaming red flag for me, that assured me in no uncertain terms my son desperately needed help, and lots of it. He needed to see a professional to get a mental evaluation. One day, one of the mothers at kindergarten arrived to pick up her little daughter Felicity from school. The trouble with little Felicity van Riesen was she was so timorous and demure, so self-effacing, that even Miss Parker sometimes forgot she was even in attendance at kindergarten, and admitted as much when she was cross-examined by the police at the time. I'm very sorry, but Felicity is so quiet. She's like a church mouse, she confided. Sometimes I don't even notice she's there. She hides in the back of the classroom and virtually disappears. She's a terribly shy young girl. Suffice to say, a search had been conducted to look for the missing child. Mrs. van Riesen had arrived to pick her daughter up from kindergarten, but Felicity was nowhere to be found, and the hysterical mother was fearing the very worst. My little baby's been abducted, she cried out indignantly. Someone help me find my baby. Mrs. van Riesen calmed down, she was told by some of the mothers who had arrived on the scene and were helping to search the kindergarten grounds for the child. She couldn't have got very far, they assured her mother. I was one of the mothers that arrived on the scene that day to pick up my son from kindergarten. I had an overwhelming, sneaky suspicion, which I clandestinely kept all to myself, that my son had something to do with Felicity's disappearance. I couldn't tell the other parents what I suspected. Curtis was my son, after all. It was instinctive for me to protect him, despite what he may have done. Thankfully, the little girl was found by one of the children's fathers, locked up in the yard shed at the bottom of the kiddies' playground. The shed was used by the gardening team once or twice a week. It was a very old shed, full of trowels, gardening forks, lawn-mowers, and of course the dust and cobwebs you'd expect to find in an old neglected little ramshackle building, used exclusively for outdoor storage. One of the fathers who'd helped look for little Felicity opened the locked shed. He'd noticed a chair outside the shed door, as if a kid had used it to climb up on in order to reach the outside lock. He opened the yard shed door, and there was a terrified girl, hiding under a shelf. She was as white as a sheet, and shaking so much, like a wobbly blancmange jelly. When she was asked how she ended up locked up in the shed for a few days, she never actually said a word. I don't know if she was reluctant to talk for fear of recrimination from my son, or whether she was just afraid. Finally, she told her parents that my son had locked her up in the shed. He had told her there was a cute little kitten in the shed that needed to be rescued. Felicity adored kittens. Once Felicity was in the shed, calling after the little kitty. My son had climbed onto the chair on the outside door to reach the lock and had locked her up in the shed. "Why would you do such a dreadful thing?" I asked my son furiously.
Felicity is so scared of spiders. She's a real baby, said my son, grinning. There are lots of spiders in the shed. I wanted her to be really scared, and she doesn't like the dark either. She's very afraid of the dark.
The troubling thing was that if we hadn't found Felicity, my son probably would never have admitted to locking her up in the shed. If no one had found her, God forbid what would have happened to her. My son seemed to lack any conscience over what he'd done. I was mortified that my son seemed to get pleasure at a 5-year-old being scared to death. I hasten to say, I took my son over to the Van Riesen household to apologize personally to little Felicity for locking her up in the shed.
"I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to scare you."
Little Felicity surprised us all when she said to my son very eloquently,
"But you did want to scare me. There was no kitten in there, was there? You locked me up in the shed on purpose so I could be with the spiders all on my own. And you knew I was scared of spiders. And you knew I was scared of the dark, but you didn't care. You're horrible, Curtis, and I'm never ever going to play with you again."
When I heard my son's lame half-hearted apology, I knew he didn't mean a word of it. I could tell he didn't care about what he'd done to Felicity, that he had little remorse for the pandemonium and distress he'd caused the Van Riesen family. The Van Riesens were terribly nice to me, considering what my son had done to their daughter. Mr. Van Riesen in particular told me not to beat myself up about it. "Kids will be kids," he assured me, rather like my husband would. "I think your son just wanted to give Felicity a harmless scare, like kids do. As I say, it's not a big deal. You know what boys are like. Don't be hard on him." I wanted to hang on to his every word and believe that my son locking up Felicity in the shed was a harmless prank. But I sensed my 5-year-old boy was far more duplicitous than he appeared, even for one so young. My son liked watching people's faces change once they were upset. It gave him a huge buzz. I remember he once dug a hole in our driveway, so when I climbed out of the truck and got my foot ensnared in the hole, my son just chuckled with laughter, so I moaned in agony, hobbling back to the front door in excruciating throbbing pain. Luckily I'd only sprained my ankle. I didn't know where the hole in the driveway had come from until I saw my son digging yet another one. I realized in that moment he intended me to trip up. He got satisfaction from seeing me wince in pain. After the unfortunate, very unsettling event with the Van Riesen girl, Felicity, that caused me as a parent a great deal of humiliation, I removed my son from that kindergarten forthwith, before I was actually asked to leave. Miss Parker had told me that the other parents were grievously upset about my son's outlandish behaviour, and I knew the next thing I could expect was for him to be expelled from the kindergarten. When did you hear of a kindergarten student being expelled? If I hadn't removed my son from that kindergarten, that would have been his fate, as the other parents would have likely complained bitterly if Curtis remained at that kindergarten. I immediately got my son, who was diagnosed at 5 years old, with conduct disorder, with callous unemotional traits, that is also called limited prosocial emotions. The telltale signs of the condition is when the child shows no remorse and disregards another child's feelings. So my son was treated with the drug risperidone, which is an antipsychotic medication found to decrease aggression in kids with conduct disorder, and he was also receiving psychotherapy. Mind you, my son was never aggressive. My son had come a long way since then, but even as a teenager I had seen signs of psychopathic tendencies in him that he had hidden so well from the world. Indeed, everyone who knew Curtis thought he was the salt of the earth. In truth, as a teenager, he was not subjecting me to the problems I was receiving from my insufferable daughter Eloise, but that in itself was a huge warning sign for me. Should he not be behaving like other teenagers? Instead, my son was stoically composed and reticently demure all the time. Our son, I told Mark. He's behaving so impeccably for a teenager, don't you think? He's not like Eloise, who throws a wobbly every 2 seconds. I'm worried he's not right in the head. Listen to yourself, Claudia. Curtis is a well-behaved teenager, and you think that that is a bad thing. You should be counting your blessings rather than smelling a rat. Look at his report cards. They always express what a remarkable young man our son is becoming. And yet you're so cynical about him. Think about it, my sweet. It is Eloise who is the nightmare in our lives at the moment, not Curtis. Our son has made steady, very productive progress. People only have high praise for him these days. I think the antisocial behaviour he exhibited when he was younger is a thing of the past.
Yes, but Mark, don't you think once a psychopath, always a psychopath?
Not necessarily, sweetheart. I mean, our son is undergoing psychiatric evaluations all the time, is he not? The psychiatrist is thrilled with his remarkable progress. He's only on 1 med. Furthermore, his conduct is impeccable. What more do you want? You can't extract blood from a stone, can you? You should be happy, Claudia, that he's growing up to be a responsible young man with a bright, promising future ahead of him. I can think of a lot of parents who would appreciate a son like our Curtis. Of course, I told myself. My husband was absolutely right. My son had changed over a brand new leaf, and I was complaining about it. What was I like? In truth, it was my daughter Eloise who was a perpetual nightmare. That daughter of mine could be as volatile as a feisty windstorm blowing over the Pacific that was notoriously fickle and unreliable. There were times I found myself almost disliking my daughter, although I never dared voice my opinions out loud. But if parents have never felt that way about their kids, believe me, they're lying through their teeth. I'm sorry, but they are. It sounds bad to be talking ill of my daughter. Of course, I loved her with all my heart. I mean, I would die for her. But living with someone so prickly as a thorn bush of briars, did not make my life easy. Sometimes I resented the fact that Mark was blindly oblivious with how challenging Eloise would be at times. He would tirelessly tell me, "Claudia, our kids are teenagers. Of course they're going to be difficult and obnoxious at times. I mean, we were teenagers. Have you forgotten what we were like? We were probably nightmares for our parents. I was pretty impossible as a teenager myself. But I promise you this, they will grow out of it." As I stood over the pan of scrambled eggs rather studiously, stirring the eggs very slowly, that I was making for the children's breakfast, Eloise impetuously thundered down the staircase, wearing her faded blue jeans and a frumpy oversized T-shirt, with her hair splayed messily around her face, that looked ominously like a dishevelled bird's nest. Why she trudged down the staircase like a hot-headed bull elephant, God only knows. For someone so slight, she certainly knew how to make a dramatic entrance. But then maybe that was the whole point. My daughter was in her freshman year, and giving me a hard time was something she relished. Mind you, she was not much better in middle school either. Like every teenager, she hated her parents with a burning passion, In her opinion, she had got a raw deal getting me as a mother. I was tirelessly hearing how much more pocket money her girlfriends got compared to her, and just how lenient other people's parents were compared to me. I'm quite sure some of the stuff she told me she made up to make me feel as if I was a dragon as a mother. I remember she told me once that in reincarnation you got to choose your parents. "If reincarnation is true," she said insolently, "what was I thinking? Choosing you as a mother," she said, squishing up her nose in disgust. "No one in their right mind would choose you as a mother, Mom." I never took offence. My daughter could be brutally cutting with her words, but that was teenagers for you. She'd grow out of it one day, I was sure. As a parent, I needed to have skin that was as tough as a rhino hide. "Why do you think you wouldn't choose me as a mother?" I'd asked her. "You're too strict, Mum. Always laying down the law, what we can and cannot do. I'm sick of it," she'd say. My lips were quivering as my incorrigible daughter entered the kitchen, with a grim look on her pretty heart-shaped face. She looked disordered, rather unkempt, if I'm being brutally honest. I was desperate to tell my daughter to brush her tousled hair. Was she really going to go to school with that disarranged hair looking so messy? If I wasn't careful, I could be accused of child neglect. I knew better than to criticize my daughter's tousled physical appearance. If I told her to tidy herself up, she'd become even more slovenly, much more belligerent. I'm sure she did it on purpose to rile me up. My daughter got a great deal of satisfaction from ruffling my feathers whenever she could. The last time I told her to brush her hair, she had run her hands deliberately through her fingers to roughen up her draggle-tailed hair all the more, and said fractiously to me, "There, Mum! Is that better?" And I kid you not, she sauntered off to school looking like something unmentionable that the cat had dragged in. Suffice to say, I had learnt from bitter experience to keep my lips tightly shut, even when it irked me to do so. "What's for breakfast, Mum?" she groaned impudently, recklessly throwing her satchel on my smart marble floor, and glancing briefly at the eggs I was scrambling in the pan, with an expression of complete revulsion on her face. I prided myself on making phenomenal scrambled eggs, in which I would add chopped bacon, spring onions, and Parmesan cheese. It had been my all-round breakfast favourite for years in my family. Even my children's school friends had decided my scrambled eggs were legendary. But judging by Eloise's wrinkled nose, as she viewed my scrambled eggs in the pan, my eggs had miraculously lost their illustrious appeal. "It's scrambled eggs," I said, giving her a bright, warm smile. "Yuck, yuck, yucky! How disgusting!" she groaned begrudgingly. "I can't stand scrambled eggs. Why do you always make scrambled eggs? I hate eggs. What else is there for breakfast, Mum?" "I'm not offering any a la carte menus, Eloise. It's eggs, toast, cereal, or yogurt. You decide." "What kind of yogurt do you have, Mum?" she asked, bustling over to the refrigerator and prizing open the door. "Oh, no, Mum," she moaned obsequiously, pulling out a large tub of yogurt from the refrigerator and reading the label. "You've got to be kidding me! You've got to be kidding me! This is a joke, right? Full-fat rhubarb yogurt! Since when have you ever bought rhubarb yogurt? Do you know how sour rhubarb is? It's disgusting! It's vile! Low-fat is better than full-fat yogurt. They put flavour in the low-fat versions. Ugh! The full-cream versions, they taste bland! Bland! "I thought a change would be nice," I said. "I'm tired of buying strawberry yogurt every time I go to the store." "Mum!" said my daughter, throwing the yogurt back into the refrigerator unabashedly. "I'm sorry, but I'm not eating rhubarb yogurt. I'm just not. Why can't you be like other people's parents? If you don't buy strawberry, then buy banana or chocolate chip. Something normal, for goodness sake. But rhubarb, you've got to be kidding me. No one in their right mind would like rhubarb, except you, of course. What cereals have you got?" she asked, trudging awkwardly over to the pantry with an exasperated look on her face and removing a large box of Weet-Bix from the cupboard with great disdain. "Yuck, Mum! Why are you always buying all bran flakes and Weet-Bix? Why don't you ever buy chocolate Rice Krispies or even Cheerios? Anything is better than this globby glook that looks like dog sick." Sweetheart, I buy whole wheat cereal because it's very good for you. Those other cereals are loaded with sugar. It's not good for your health to eat all that sugar. Eloise crinkled up her nose again. I think, Mum, I can decide what to put in my body, given it's my body, it's not yours. I'm sick of these opinionated people all over the place, jumping up and down the bandwagon, telling us what we can and cannot eat. It's pathetic. This is my body. I'm in charge of my body. I choose what I put in it. Do you know, Mum, Jennifer Patterson gets chocolate Nutella spread on her toast every single morning for breakfast. She says in Italy they eat chocolate spread on their toast every single morning. She stayed with her relatives in Florence for a whole month, and they had chocolate spread for breakfast all the time. Why can't we have chocolate spread like the Pattersons do? I tell you what, Eloise, I'll buy some chocolate spread for the long weekend when we go to the cabin. But we're not making a habit of eating it regularly like the Pattersons do. I'm sorry, but there's too much sugar in the product. What's going on? Asked my son Curtis, entering the kitchen with a warm, benevolent smile on his face that always made my heart melt. That son of mine was so angelic looking, even at 16 years old, and he was getting better looking every single day. Oh, something smells delicious, Mum. Is that your eggs you're cooking? I'm famished. He leaned over the pan of the eggs I was stirring to inhale the cheesy aroma appreciatively, unlike his sister. I removed the pan from the heat very quickly to make sure that the eggs didn't dry out, as they still continue to cook in a hot pan, even when they're removed from the stovetop. Mum, they look incredible, as usual, he said, giving me a goofy grin. You make the best scrambled eggs in the world, Mum. I had scrambled eggs at camp once. They were nothing like yours. They were powdery, insipid, tasteless. Curtis was a charming, handsome young man. But then again I would say that because I'm his mother. Most mothers think the world of their sons. I felt that way about Curtis. He had inherited his father's chocolate-coloured eyes. He was the son that never brought me any trouble. This morning he was impeccably dressed in a blue dress shirt with cream chinos and smart leather shoes. My son always wore dress shirts to school, and his blonde locks were perfectly brushed without a straggly hair out of place. Why could Eloise not pick up a few pointers from her older brother in presentation? Curtis was 16 years old, 2 years away from college. He was learning to drive, and was deferential, chivalrous, and courteous, so much so that I had to remind myself that he was still on meds, and was still receiving psychological treatment, so he was a long way from being perfect. Would you like some eggs, sweetheart? I asked Curtis, piling some scrambled eggs onto his plate. Mum, did you have to ask me that? When have I ever said no to your eggs? No one makes them like you do, as I keep telling you. I think I want to be sick. You're such a creep, Curtis, said Eloise contemptuously, looking at her brother in abject disgust. Always sucking up to Mummy, Mum, and the teachers at school. You're not normal, Curtis. It's called being polite, said Curtis. You should try it sometimes, Eloise. Eloise began to pour some milk over her Weet-Bix, but after one bite she abandoned her bowl and put it on the floor in disgust for little Rochester to eat. Our easily pleased Jack Russell was always happy to wolf up my kids' leftovers. It was a miracle that the dog remained reasonably slim. If I ate my kids' leftovers, I'd be the size of an army tank, but the less said about that, the better. Those whole wheat Bix are disgusting! Oh my God! They taste like vomit! I hate whole wheat cereal. It makes me want to puke. Why don't we have anything decent to eat in this house like normal people do? Saskia Brammingstoke says her dad makes blueberry pancakes for breakfast almost every morning, which he serves with maple syrup and, would you believe it, ice cream, and lots of it. Saskia Brammingstoke has ice cream for breakfast. Get that. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. I'm so jealous. Why do some people have all the luck? It's so not fair. Well, I'm sorry, Eloise. I apologise profusely for not being Saskia Brammingstoke's mother, and for not serving you ice cream for breakfast every morning. But I have to draw the line somewhere, don't I? You'll thank me one day when you don't get early onset diabetes, or blow up like a balloon, like Violet Beauregard in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. She was taken to the de-juicing room, wasn't she? I'd have to take you to the de-creaming room. Very funny, Mum. You think you're so clever. I'm far from amused. Stop being so sarky. I hate it when you're sarky. It's cringy. It really is. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to pull your leg, but I just couldn't resist. Oh, my word, said Eloise, glancing out of the kitchen window in abject horror. I can't believe it. I didn't notice how grim it was out there this morning. You got to be kidding me. Look at the weather. It's bucketing down with rain. I'm sorry, Mum, but there is no way on God's earth I'm walking to that school bus. My hair will get completely messed up. I might just catch my death of cold. Did my daughter have any comprehension that her dishevelled hair looked like a bird's nest this morning? If she wandered outside for long enough, some bird might accidentally just lay its egg in it. That was quite literally how dreadful it looked. I wondered if my daughter ever looked in the mirror, for she was quite a sorry sight. Your hair, sis, said Curtis. I don't mean to be rude, but it looks... Looks what, Curtis? Said Eloise, snapping. Go on, say it. I dare you. Tell me what you really think. Well, it looks a bit messy, doesn't it, sis? I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm just stating a fact. How dare you, Curtis? I haven't spent ages fixing my hair up this morning for nothing. I can't believe you're being so rude. Curtis raised a scathing brow. You never fixed your hair up, sis. Quit telling me porkies. You're always looking for excuses for Mum to drive us to school. That's what this is really about, isn't it? We can use umbrellas. We'll be just fine. So, Mum, are you taking us to school then or not? There's no way that I'm going to walk out in that rain, said Eloise, punching the air with her fists. Of course I'll run you both to school, but only if you eat something first, Eloise. Do I have to, Mum? There's nothing decent in this entire household to eat. Yes, you do, Eloise. You need to lie on your stomach so that you can concentrate on your lessons today. You need the glucose in your bloodstream. It's very important. It really was a miserable day, in every sense of the word, as I drove my children to school. It probably was a good thing I was taking them, as the driving conditions were treacherous and cars were skidding all over the place. Some people had no comprehension about how to drive safely in dangerous conditions. It never failed to amaze me. I had already passed an unfortunate accident on the road where someone went skating into another car, but luckily both passengers emerged from their cars unscathed. I drove a large, cumbersome, rather ungainly SUV, which I absolutely loathed. I'd previously owned a much swankier, slimline car, which made me feel footloose and fancy-free. It was a red Alpha Spider convertible with a retractable roof, which I could drive with my hair blowing against the wind. But my beloved Spider had to go, as unfortunately I had to ferry my children to and from school, along with their extracurricular activities, like a long-suffering chauffeur. So unfortunately I'd been saddled with this much heftier car, which was more like an army tank, to put it mildly. I hated driving the graceless thing, which seemed to be the trendy, rather fashionable choice among the mothers at my children's school. I hasten to say it took me a long time to get used to driving something so impossibly chunky. But it was practical, and as far as having kids is concerned, as a mother, you naturally make those sacrifices on behalf of them. I had told myself that once the children left home, my SUV would be a thing of the past. The menacing thunder boomed threateningly in a soggy, pewter-coloured sky, like a powerful drum roll, while the fierce lightning thrashed its yellow jagged lights in the dismally dark, gloomy grey abyss. And my kids, who were normally heavily entrenched in the tangled distraction of their cell phones, usually music videos or YouTube or God knows what else, were staring out of the window rather bedazzled by the storm. I think the drama of a belligerently capricious thunderstorm has a rather mesmerising effect on most of us, grabbing our attention. The sky certainly looked like a cantankerous old man this morning, having a hissy fit because his wife had added garlic to the Sunday roast. It was ominously silent in the car. No one said a word, as I drove down the glistening grey ribbon of asphalt towards my children's school. The rain relentlessly tapped at the windows, like a witch's fingernails. My windscreen wipers were working furiously under the strain of the powerful deluge, where on the road puddles of water were turning into treacherous ponds, while my rubber tires were skating through them all. Maybe there were some benefits to driving a four-wheel drive after all. Then quite suddenly, masterfully intruding upon the stoic silence, came the loud blasts of my cell phone, with its annoying, jarring ringtone. My husband Mark is a tech guy, but I've never managed to change that ringtone on my cell phone, which on the face of it is ridiculous. I had one of those frivolous accessories my husband insisted upon, for safety reasons, which was a magnetic stand for my cell phone, designed for cars so anyone calling me, I would be able to take their calls on speakerphone without needing to take my hands off the steering wheel. One glance at the caller ID, and I groaned in dismay. It was my sister Beryl calling me, and right now she was the last person in the entire world I felt like speaking to. My sister Beryl was one of those garrulous chatterboxes that could make a parrot seem quiet. This morning I would have been quite happy not to open my mouth and say a single word. But Beryl's fortuitous phone call had robbed me of that privilege, the privilege of being able to bask in the pleasure of my own thoughts. Beryl only ever phoned when she wanted something, and there were no prizes for guessing what that opinionated, loud-mouthed woman wanted this time. I could second-guess my sister every time. She was as transparent as a pane of glass, and as predictable as the coffee I drank every morning. It was likely she wanted to offload her son Elliot on me, yet again, after another explosive altercation with her husband Rusty. If my sister would get her act together and stop spending money like water, maybe there would be an end to her persistent fallouts with her husband. By all accounts, the ever-patient, relatively easy-going, long-suffering Rusty resented his wife's needless extravagance, the way she sailed through the money he earned, as if it grew on trees, which I found remarkably disrespectful of my sister, who failed to fully appreciate her husband's sacrifices on her behalf. I'd never known anyone work as hard as Rusty did, and although he earned a sizable income, it must have been distressing watching his wife whittle away his finances. He told me once it would be nice to have invested some of that money, but with a wife like Beryl, who believed in living in the moment, that was never going to happen. I had clandestinely sympathized with Rusty's plight, for my brother-in-law was indeed one of the kindest people I'd ever met. How he put up with my sister's shenanigans, God only knows, but in my book that made him a saint, and on that point my parents wholeheartedly agreed. Growing up with my sister, I knew how she had proficiently taken the art of sulking to a whole new level, and used it artfully as a cunning manipulative tool to get her own way in everything, and it had worked expeditiously for her. I hasten to say, growing up, she created such a miserable atmosphere in our home. When she didn't get her own way, she would pout, refuse to talk for many days, stamp her feet, and slam doors and windows as loudly as she could to make her point fully known. In the end, it made my parents' life a whole lot easier, giving in to her every whim, just to keep the peace. So she had become, dare I say, spoilt and self-entitled. I had been the long-suffering older sister, whom she naturally gravitated towards, who was rather useful, to fix up all her messes for her, which is likely what she wanted me for right now. I mean, I ask you, why change the perennial habits of a lifetime? Little did my sister know, when she married Rusty Bodenasser, she had more than met her match. Ostensibly, whenever those two stubbornly engaged in fights together, they were of the silent kind, which meant they didn't speak to each other for days on end. Let me tell you, for the record, those are the most unpleasant kind of fights to ever engage in. They drag on for days and days, like a boring, drudgerous boardroom meeting at the office that never seems to come to an end. That was when I was naturally called into play. My sister didn't want her son Elliot to be caught up in the thick, foggy, muddy mire of one of their silent altercations, and that was when, true to form, she would dump him on me like an unwanted sack of potatoes. I groaned as I answered the phone call, but avoiding my sister's call was not an option. If I didn't pick up this phone call, the next thing I'd find is when I returned home, she'd be there waiting for me. I would be left to listen to the long, drawn-out saga about her latest fight, whereupon she'd tell me, Rusty didn't understand her. Rusty was being completely unreasonable. Rusty was being so insensitive. Rusty this and Rusty that. It was always somebody else's fault in my sister's world. She'd never take responsibility for anything at all. If she'd been mature enough to do the right thing, she might actually be able to procure less tension in her own household and radically reduce the fighting quite significantly. But my sister seemed to thoroughly enjoy riding the tumultuous, tempestuous storms in life. It would seem drama followed her everywhere she went, like an obedient toy poodle. "Hello, Beryl. Everything all right?" I asked, knowing full well that I needed to brace myself for what was to come next. "No, it's not, sis, I'm afraid. Me and Rusty, well, we're not talking. Well, we've had another one of those Barneys. Of course, it's entirely his fault. The man can say the rudest, most offensive, insulting things at times. Honestly, I don't know why I put up with him. He had the audacity to call me a spendthrift and a bored housewife. He told me I spent money because I got nothing better to do with my time, that I'm bored, that I should find a positive outlet beyond just shopping. Can you believe that? The sheer impertinence of it all. How can he speak to me like that? Well, I refuse to allow him to speak to me like that, that is for sure. And do you know, he went into my purse. Now listen to this. I am appalled by what he did next. You're hardly going to believe it, but I promise you it is the truth. He has never done this before, sis, but he did it. He cut up 4 of my credit cards. Can you believe it? How dare he do such a thing? I mean, I'm absolutely livid, but I'm getting those cards replaced as soon as I possibly can. I've already ordered their replacements. I refuse to be bullied by Rusty. No one tells me what I can and cannot do with my life and with my money, and even with my time. I'm sorry, but I'm just not going to put up with it. You've got a good man there, Beryl, I told her. He loves the bones of you, but maybe he wants you to tame your spending a wee little. You do buy rather a lot of stuff. Do you really need it all? I mean, you've got thousands and thousands of pairs of shoes. How are you ever going to get to wear them all? If I bought as much stuff as you did, my husband would have a coronary arrest on the spot. Not you too, sis. I expected you to be on my side. I breathed a huge sigh. You know, Beryl, I'm always on your side. But I don't agree with your outrageous spending. I'm sorry, but I just don't. Whenever Rusty challenges you on it, the next thing I know, the two of you are at loggerheads with each other. And the issue is always about the spending. If you just cut back a bit, I'm sure things would not get so inflamed in your household. I take it you're not speaking to each other. Is that what this is about? You want me to look after little Elliot for you, until the storm dies down, until Rusty apologizes for calling you those dreadfully unfair names? I said a little sarcastically. Oh, sis, you are an absolute gem. I knew I could rely on you. You never let me down. I'll drop Elliot at your house after school today. I would thoroughly appreciate it if he could stay with you for the whole long weekend. Things in our house are just a little tense at the moment, and I don't want Elliot to witness that. I don't want him to be suspicious that we're fighting. It's really not good for young children to be exposed to their parents' Barneys, if you know what I mean. I think I read something about that somewhere. It can be very distressing for them, you know. You do know, Beryl, that this long weekend I'm taking both my children to our cabin in the countryside. And Elliot is so welcome to join us, but as long as you appreciate where we're going, it's practically in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes the cell phone reception can be rather mediocre. So if you want to phone, well, your son, there's no guarantees you'll be able to speak to him. That's not a problem at all. That's the least of my worries. I'm sure he'll have the whale of a time with all of you. Thank you. It'll do him good to get into the countryside. My son could do with a break. And I think we could do with a break from him as well, not to put too fine a point on it. Good then, it's settled, Beryl. Speak to you later, I said, disconnecting the call gratefully and releasing a sizable sigh. As I had anticipated, both of my children audibly groaned in the back of the car. They both did not relish the idea of spending time with their 12-year-old cousin, who they perceived was still a baby. I don't believe it! Why do you always say exactly what Aunt Beryl wants, Mum? She practically bullies you to have Elliot every time. And now we're going to be lumbered with our cousin again, said Eloise scathingly. I just was looking so forward to this long weekend, and now Elliot has to come along. Just our luck. He's going to ruin everything for us. Now, don't be so unreasonable. Elliot is a lovely, lovely young man, I assured my daughter. Elliot's account. I wasn't at all surprised when my mother announced that I would be spending the entire weekend with my Aunt Claudia. Every time she and my father engaged in a fight, my mother would dump me off at my aunt's home, whereupon I'd have to spend the entire weekend with my two cousins. Let's just say Eloise was so annoying, always grumbling, groaning and complaining, throwing tantrums like fireworks on the 4th of July. But at least she wore her heart on her sleeve, and you knew what she was thinking. My mother said she behaved like that because her hormones were flying all over the place and that teenagers could be downright mean. I knew when I got to her age, I'd never ever behave like that. I mean, it's so embarrassing to be so capriciously belligerent and to have tantrums all the time. One time I saw her get irate with Aunt Claudia, just because my aunt had forgotten to buy tomato ketchup for her chips. She got so incensed, it was like World War III had broken out. My cousin Curtis was the one that I could never quite figure out. I liked to keep a healthy, safe distance from him, even though he was reasonably polite to me. But I always thought there was something insidious about him that left me feeling slightly on edge. I told my mother once about my misgivings over Curtis. I don't really like him, Mum. There's something off about him. Goodness gracious me, sweetheart, my mother had said to me. I'll have you know, your cousin Curtis is an exemplary student. He's one of the most well-mannered, chivalrous young men I have ever met. I don't know where you get your bizarre notions from, but I tell you, he is a perfectly lovely boy. Maybe my mother was right. She'd always told me never to judge a book by its cover. I know, for example, in town, for a long time I had misjudged this poor homeless man. He slept outside the bakery with his black and white dog he called Cauliflower. The dog was a collie, and the homeless man told me she was as lovely as a flower, hence the name Cauliflower. I thought of him as nothing more than a dirty, unkept man who could not get a job for himself. I really looked on him with very little pity, but that all quickly changed. I found out that he'd fought in Afghanistan and was a war hero. Now that's impressive. I had felt such shame when I realized I had misjudged him so needlessly. I always made sure I gave him some of my pocket money when I was in town, and sometimes I even gave him cans of dog food for Cauliflower to enjoy. It seemed such a dreadful shame that he was now homeless on the street, but I imagine the horrors of war had derailed him in some way, and he just couldn't get back on course with his life, which is perfectly understandable in the circumstances. The post-traumatic stress that ensues after fighting in a war can easily break a man whose eyes have seen far too much. So maybe my mother was absolutely right. Perhaps I needed to cut my cousin Curtis some slack, give him the benefit of the doubt. But why did I have a gut feeling that he harboured a dark side to his character, that he clandestinely hid rather well from the world? But I kept those troubling thoughts all to myself and never spoke of them to anyone. Suffice to say, I loathed it when both my parents fought. My mother thought I was a complete ignoramus and didn't have a clue what was actually going on in our home. But of course I knew. I wasn't stupid. My parents, when they fought, did not speak to each other for days on end. How could I not notice that? They'd brush past each other rather abrasively in the passageway, sometimes with a hostile push, or would sit at the dinner table, glaring at each other like two cats that would seriously like to scratch each other's eyes out. They would try to disguise their anger with half-hearted expressions, and did their level best to pretend everything was normal in our household, when it so obviously was not. You could sometimes cut the silence in our house with a knife. When it came to eating dinner at the dining room table, they'd avoid looking at each other, focusing their attention all on me, asking me questions like, "How was your day at school today, Elliot? What are you doing in American history now?" But all the while, they willfully ignored each other. I thought my parents could be so juvenile at times. Sometimes I thought I was the only mature one in the family. I really wished that they could fight like normal people, have an argument, cool down, make up, so that they would ultimately move on with their lives. But not my parents. Never my parents. Their disquieting fights could last for days on end. They were sometimes unendurable, as the house would feel like a pressure cooker, building up, and you were waiting for an explosion to happen. But it never did. Did my mother really think that I was so blind that I didn't notice that my father had been relegated to the couch for an entire week? He'd pretend to me he'd fallen asleep, been unable to go to bed during the night. But the main bedroom where my parents slept had been locked by my mother, with a red sign on the outside which read, "Go away! Leave me alone!" Oh dear me! Look at me! I must have watched television and fallen asleep. Ended up sleeping here on the couch. But during my parents' silent wars, the sleeping on the couch happened every single night. Of course, in our household, I knew what the fight was about. It was always over the same old thing, which reared up its ugly head like a shark fin in the Pacific. My mother's unbridled spending was seriously out of control. If my father ever briefly mentioned the problem to my mother, she'd become very defensive and overreactive. I suspect it was because underneath it all, she knew she had a problem and was refusing to admit it to herself. My mother could be very stubborn like that. She once told me that shopping gave her such a buzz, something I never appreciated because every time she returned from a shopping spree, happy she most certainly was not. She'd come in with hundreds of shopping bags, bringing them all into the house and then throwing them into the spare room to gather dust, never looking at them again, which I thought was decidedly odd. "How dare you, Rusty?" she'd say to my father impetuously. "What are you implying? That I'm a spendthrift or something? You couldn't be more wrong. I'll have you know, every single thing I brought today I really need, and yet you begrudge me, your wife, the most basic of life necessities. How can you be so inconsiderate, so narrow-minded?" Woe betide if my father remotely hinted, with a random peppering of very selective benign words, that she should stop shopping so excessively. Was there not something better she could do with her time, perhaps? How about taking up art or joining a book club? "Are you saying that I spend too much money? That's exactly what you're saying," she would say, looking as prickly as Sonic the Hedgehog. "Yes, I am, Beryl. I'm sorry, but your spending is out of control. You need to rein it in, you really do." My mother's mouth would curl down into a large frown, and she would march off indignantly, and the war in our household would have begun. Eyes would roll, doors would slam, feet would march, and the silence would become deafening. In truth, sometimes I wanted to scream in frustration. Both my parents could make me so mad at times. I'm afraid I was on my father's side on this. Don't get me wrong, I love my parents equally, but I'm sorry, no one needs closets of shoes and thousands of new clothes that you'll probably never get to wear in an entire lifetime. It was frivolously extravagant, a complete waste of money, and beyond anything else, completely meaningless. That's what Solomon describes it in the Bible as. A chasing after the wind, he would likely call it. My mother's spending had become so insatiable that her shopping now took up occupancy in 2 of our spare bedrooms, that could no longer be used for accommodating any guests who might want to stay at our home. It was beginning to become a sizable problem in our house. The elephant in the room you dare not discuss. My father was a prudently practical man, happy with the simple things in life. So all the excessive frills my mother brought into his life, with all her bits and bobs lying all over the place like the discarded plastics found floating in the ocean, was very unsettling for my father, and me besides. Suffice to say, my mother was as stubborn as a mule. She'd never back down, never admit she was wrong, never take responsibility for an argument. If indeed she was a male elk fighting for mating rights, she'd defeat all her competitors without a problem. So it was invariably my father, who, although equally as obdurate as my mother, had had enough of all the discord. So after a few days of intolerable silence, he'd come to my mother, with his tail between his legs, to apologise profusely. "I'm so sorry, Beryl. I can't bear the mood in this house a moment longer. I've missed you so much, my love. Please, will you forgive me? I admit the fight was entirely my fault. You are not to blame in any of it." It was only when Rusty took responsibility for an argument that may not have been instigated by him in the first place, and probably was not, the peace in our household would thankfully be restored. When my parents made up, the heaviness of our household would lift like a dark thundercloud dissipating in the sky until it had totally gone away, and all that was left behind was a happy rainbow. Even though my mother told me I was going away for the long weekend with Aunt Claudia and my cousins, I was not excited. A break in the countryside would be amazing, of course, but that was not the problem. Both my cousins looked on me as a tadpole that had not developed into a frog yet. I was a teeny bopper in their eyes. I think the condescending Curtis considered himself to be so grown up, especially since he was learning to drive. He never let us forget that either. Suffice to say, they were always rather dismissive towards me, made me feel most unwelcome in their home. I suppose I couldn't blame them, really. I guess they didn't enjoy me being thrust upon them all the time. Did they really think I enjoyed hanging around them? I would have so much preferred to be at home with my parents. The journey to my aunt's and uncle's cabin was about an hour and 40 minutes' drive from Chestnut Hill, where we lived in Philadelphia, which is known as the Garden District, boasting lovely eateries and shopping opportunities, as well as fabulous historic mansions. I hasten to say both our families lived in old Victorian houses in Germanston Avenue. A trip under 2 hours was not too bad as far as American road trips go. It was long enough for me having to sit next to my cousin Curtis in the back, which was painstaking enough. Although I got to sit right next to Rochester, the family's adorable Jack Russell Terrier, who would be propped up on lots and lots of pillows next to me, so he could peer out of the window and observe the changing, resplendent scenery as we drove through the countryside. He was such a curious, inquisitive dog, thoroughly interested in everything, but I noticed he kept a safe distance away from Curtis, as if he didn't trust my cousin an inch. If Russell got close to little Rochester, he'd growl, displaying all his canine teeth. Eloise always got to sit next to her mother in the front, even though Curtis, who was quite tall, at just under 6 foot, had such long legs, it was crazy he didn't occupy the front seat next to his mother. But he politely gave Eloise, his sister, the best seat in the car, because he was a gentleman. Not that Eloise appreciated his generosity. I think she thought it was mandatory that she got the best seat in the car. When I climbed into the car on the day of our trip to the cabin, both of my cousins glanced up at me briefly from their cell phones, barely acknowledging me. Curtis said, "How are you doing, Elliot?" but never even bothered to listen to my response, so I never gave it to him. I mean, how rude is that? Eloise could not resist turning the knife in when she said, "You again, Elliot. Why am I not surprised? Your mother had another fallout, has she, with your father?" "Something like that," I admitted bleakly. "What's wrong with them? They're grown up, for God's sake," she said, rolling her eyes in disgust. "Don't they even know how to kiss and make up, like normal people?" "Honestly, Eloise," my Aunt Claudia interceded, "don't give Elliot a hard time about this. It's hardly his fault his parents are fighting." "Don't you think I know that, Mum? It's Aunt Beryl. She's so pathetic, isn't she? If she didn't stop shopping so much, then Elliot wouldn't keep being dumped on us over and over again, like an odious bad smell that we have to put up with." "Now, don't be unkind, Eloise. That wasn't necessary, was it?" said my aunt, giving me a warm, reassuring smile from the visor's mirror. "It's such a pleasure to have you here with us, Elliot. I'm so glad you could come. I think you're really going to enjoy staying at the cabin. It's been in my husband's family for over 3 generations, you know. I know you've never been there before, but there's so many things to do at the cabin. Fishing, ATV riding, bicycling, exploring, you name it." "Curtis," she said, raising her voice to get my cousin's attention, "I think it would be very nice if you took Elliot fishing. You could row on the lake together. Won't that be fun, Elliot?" When my aunt mentioned the lake, my legs began to shake involuntarily. My teeth rattled in my jaw. I didn't want to tell my aunt my clandestine secret, but I better let the cat out of the bag, even if my cousins made fun of me, because they needed to know the truth. Otherwise I could get embroiled in some sticky situations that I didn't want to have to face.
"I'm not sure, Aunt Claudia. I'm not sure that I should actually go rowing. On the lake, I mean. What if I was to fall into the water. I can't swim, you see."
I could feel the full weight of my cousin's astonished eyes as they stared at me. I could see a glimmer of a grin developing on Curtis's face. "You can't swim," he said, looking heartily amused by my embarrassing revelation. "You can't swim, Elliot?" asked my aunt incredulously. "But I don't understand. Didn't you learn how to swim at school?"
I have a fear of drowning," I told my aunt. I've had night terrors all my life about it, Aunt Claudia. The teacher told me that I didn't need to swim at school until I received lots of counselling. But I never got to receive any counselling. Maybe then I would be able to swim." "Oh, yes, Elliot. I must apologise. It rings a bell, your night terrors, I mean. I seem to remember your mother mentioning something about them to me. Well, you mustn't worry, Elliot. You won't fall into the water. It's perfectly safe to take the boat out. Even if you were to fall in, and that's very unlikely. Your cousins are both strong swimmers, so they'd rescue you. There's nothing to worry about on that score." "The best way to learn to swim is to be dropped into the deep end," said Curtis, with a nasty twinkle in his eye that left me feeling very discomposed. "That's what I did with Rochester when he was a puppy. I took him out on the boat, threw him into the water. He swam back on his own accord to shore." "You did what?" asked my Aunt Claudia. "You mean you threw little Rochester into the water when he was a puppy? And left him to his own defences? He could have drowned, Curtis. What the hell were you thinking? That is irresponsible, completely selfish, and incredibly cruel. Rochester was a puppy. How could you?" "Don't overreact, Mum. Keep your hair on. He didn't drown, did he? He swam to shore, and now he's no longer afraid of the water, thanks to me." My aunt almost growled. I could tell Curtis's startling revelations of what he'd done to Rochester as a vulnerable puppy left her feeling bereft. "How could you, Curtis? I am mortified by what you've just told me. We could have lost Rochester. If you did that to any other puppy, it would more than likely have drowned. It's a miracle that Rochester didn't drown. You must never, and I repeat, never do something like that again. Promise me you won't." Curtis mumbled something inaudible under his breath. I was shocked by my cousin's revelation. No wonder little Rochester did not trust him. Imagine what he must have felt like, being so cruelly abandoned in a large body of water. I mean, who did that to a puppy? I was ashamed I could not swim. It was a contentious, rather uncomfortable subject for me. Since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I'd been haunted by the most discomposing nightmares, where I'd find myself in a large lake, being dragged under the ice-cold water by a large, gnarled hand. I tried to fight my way up to the air, to get free from this hand that enveloped me so tightly, but the water on the lake had frozen above my head, and was rock-hard, like a pane of glass that I couldn't shatter. I don't know how the dream ended. I'd start to scream, and my little body would break out into a terrible sweat so that my clothes became drenched to the skin. My well-meaning mother had been informed to take me to a counsellor who specialised in children dealing with horrifying fears. But on the very first appointment, she got waylaid by a stunning boutique she happened to pass in the car. And the next thing I knew, she spent the entire afternoon buying dresses and purses for herself, and my appointment with the therapist had long since been forgotten. I never went to those therapy sessions, so as a result, I never overcame my fear of the water. "We are nearly there," said my aunt. "That was a quick drive, wasn't it? Wasn't too bad." She said this with a warm smile. "Unfortunately, Elliot, your Uncle Mark, he's not joining us on this adventure, I'm afraid. He's going to a conference this weekend." I was disappointed to hear that, as I really liked my Uncle Mark, and knew that even if my cousins ignored me all weekend, at least I could talk to my uncle. But now he wasn't coming. I'd have to settle for being entertained by Aunt Claudia, as I was certain my cousins would likely leave me to my own devices and wilfully ignore me, as they always did. I watched Aunt Claudia driving her huge SUV off the main asphalt roads that wound into smaller tributaries like the lines in the palm of your hand. Finally, we were on a remote dirt road in the middle of nowhere that was only ever used by a handful of people, I was told, which was why it had never ever been asphalted, and believe me, you knew it.
My aunt's car took a great deal of strain, as the heavy tyres walloped over uneven holes in the road, so that everything juddered and shook rather precariously, and we bounced up and down on our seats like the men in a rodeo. My aunt finally drove down this long earthen driveway, covered in the mulch of fallen leaves, surrounded by alpine fields of knee-high grass and pretty wild flowers. Finally we reached the cabin, that looked like something you'd expect to see on Little House on the Prairie. It was so pretty and picturesque, made from 200-year-old wooden beams. Frankly, I was rather surprised that my cousins would appreciate a place like this in the middle of nowhere, with basic amenities. The cabin was utterly charming. It was cleaned regularly so that everything was in pristine condition, and that no mice could make their nests in the sofa, which I gather had happened one year. The cabin boasted a water tank, a gas-fired refrigerator, a range oven, wood-burning stove, and a large, sumptuous fireplace. And during the evening, the cabin was lit up by profane lamps. It overlooked a very large silvery lake that glistened in the morning light, reflecting the sculptural-looking willow trees with their long leaves caressing the surface. It would seem the lake invited all kinds of exciting bird life, and there were wild ducks with their ducklings bobbing among the reeds that fringed the borders of the lake. I marvelled how something as breathtakingly beautiful as this exquisite lake could be so treacherously dangerous. I was amazed that little Rochester had managed to swim to safety as a little puppy, because I knew if the boot had been on the other foot, I'd never have been able to do that. That all-expansive lake was so intimidating. There was a boathouse and a fishing pier. It was amazing how my cousins' personalities changed the moment we arrived at the cabin. It was like they shedded their pretentiously grown-up bravados and became kids again. I think the cabin held so many wistfully nostalgic memories for them that it brought out the whimsical, fun-loving side of their natures, and they included me in absolutely everything. I was amazed that cell phones were also thrust to one side, as we enjoyed ourselves riding SUVs and bicycles down some of the beautiful country trails. After several exciting boat trips on the water where I was rowing all on my own, I felt confident that Claudia was right, and the boat was extremely sturdy. I'd never fall in unless I was pushed, but that wasn't going to happen. I watched my cousins enviously swimming in the lake, splashing around like little kids, and Eloise kept throwing sticks in the water for Rochester to retrieve. Rochester would never go after any sticks that Curtis threw for him, which I found peculiarly strange. That little dog did not like Curtis. I discovered I actually was thoroughly enjoying myself here at the cabin, and believe it or not, I was beginning to warm to my cousins. I went fishing with Eloise and her brother at the fishing pier, which was a little wobbly and unsteady, but we cast out our lines, and I managed to bring in a huge catfish that made Eloise and her brother's catches seem pitifully small and pathetic by contrast. I couldn't help noticing a shift in Curtis's mood when he witnessed my incredulous catch. He became quite short, crabby, tetchy, more than a little waspy towards me, and seemed incredibly aggrieved that I had caught a bigger fish than he had done, even though he said, "Well done, Elliot. I think you got lucky today, catching such a big fish for the first time. Call it beginner's luck." I could see that the smile was insincere on his face, and most certainly did not meet his dark chocolate-coloured eyes. I realised that my irascible cousin had been afflicted with a touch of the green-eyed monster. There could be no mistaking how disenchanted and hang-dog his expression had become, as he trailed rather despondently behind me and Eloise back to the cabin, carrying 2 small fish in his hands, while mine was the size of a small dog, and seemed to weigh half a ton. I don't mind admitting I was puffed up with pride when I returned to the cabin with my impressive trophy. Aunt Claudia made such a fuss about my illustrious catch, taking tons of photographs which she sent off to her sister, and Curtis looked more and more beleaguered, like a dark thundercloud, especially when his mother said, "Oh, is that all you caught, Curtis?" She patted him sympathetically on the back, in a consolatory way. "Never mind, Curtis. Better luck next time." Curtis's face burned the bright red colour of a field of poppies. He didn't enjoy being overshadowed by his little cousin, and was not a happy bunny, if ever I saw one. My Aunt Claudia cooked the fish I'd caught for dinner, and I hasten to say it melted in our mouths like butter. I'd never tasted anything quite so delicious. "Oh, my God!" said Eloise, stuffing a small new potato in her mouth with gusto.
It was so hilarious, Mum, at the fishing pier. When Elliot caught the huge catfish, you should have seen Curtis's face. His eyes were almost popping out of his head. He was so jealous. I wasn't jealous, insisted Curtis. As I told Elliot here, it was just beginner's luck. Oh, please, Curtis, since when have you ever caught a fish that size? We've been coming to the cabin for years, and you have never, ever caught a fish like Elliot did.
Curtis remained very quiet, far too quiet. But underneath the deep, dense layers of that foreboding silence, an ominous storm was brewing. One I never did see coming, but it would fortuitously soon make its inauspicious appearance known. For the time being, it remained masterfully buried behind Curtis's rather grim expression. I could perceive that his sister's teasing had ruffled his feathers ever so slightly, and he was far from amused. But I think Eloise had hit the nail on the head. My cousin Curtis was burning with jealousy, trying desperately to hide it, but he wasn't fooling anyone, least of all me.
I told you, sis, it was beginner's luck, he said gingerly. And for the record, I was not jealous of Elliot's catch today. If you must know, I'm proud of my little cousin here, he said obsequiously, reaching out to pat me on the hand with a patronizing gesture. On the last night we were staying at the cabin, I was more than a little surprised to find myself being woken up by Curtis in the middle of the night, in the early hours of the morning, when it was still rather dark outside. Over the last couple of days, Curtis had been especially nice to me, and had redeemed himself considerably. I think he was secretly rather impressed by my fishing skills, and the large catfish I had managed to procure. Could it be that he was no longer viewing me as his silly little immature cousin Elliot, but he was looking on me as an adult, his equal, taking me serious for once in his life? I was mature for my age. I felt so happy that Curtis was paying me so much attention. It made me feel grown up, important, and gave me a sense of belonging. In the past, I'd always felt like a fish out of water in the Hannon household. But finally, they were letting me in, welcoming me into their lives as a valuable member of the family. It was almost as if Curtis had become like a big brother to me. How could I have misjudged him so badly? I think he was quite a self-contained, polite person who kept himself to himself. Maybe I had misinterpreted his introverted personality as being aloof and indifferent. I had gotten him so wrong. Now here he was, waking me up in the middle of the night, eager to include me in a late-night adventure like this. He wouldn't be doing this if he didn't really like me, I thought, feeling my bumptiously cocky chest swell up with pride. I sat up in bed, wiping the sleep from my eyes. I groaned. I had been thoroughly enjoying my sleep. To be rudely awoken by Curtis like this was not something I fully appreciated. But then again, my big cousin paying me so much personal attention, well, it felt amazingly good.
"Elliot," my cousin whispered, "it's our last night at the cabin. Well, in truth, it's early morning. It's just the sun hasn't risen yet. I thought we could go out onto the lake and enjoy watching the sun rise. What about it, bro?"
"But it's dark, Curtis," I said, trembling, hoping my cousin hadn't seen my body beginning to quiver at the mere suggestion of going out on the water in the middle of the night like this. I didn't want Curtis to think I was a wuss or a great big baby, especially now when things between us were so good, and he was viewing me so differently. I could feel a hollow develop in the pit of my stomach. "It's dark out there, and you know I can't swim. I mean, what if I fell into the lake?" My cousin's lips twitched, as if there was a flicker of a smile developing on his face that he tried to suppress, but not very well. He physically stiffened and studied me quizzically through his dark brown eyes that almost looked a little cold.
"Elliot," he said, "you know I've got your back. Besides, the boat is perfectly safe. You've no idea how wonderful it is to be out on the lake at night, staring up at the stars. There's nothing like it in the whole world. And the best moment is when the sun rises and it breaks over the water. It's transfixing, It really is. Do you really want to miss out on all this fun because of a silly little pet fear you have over the water? It's no different going out on the water at night as it is during the day. Only a zillion times better, I can promise you of that. I especially asked you to come with me, Elliot, 'cause I like you a lot. There is no way I was ever going to ask Eloise to join us. Can you imagine? She'd be moaning like a minnie if I tried to get her out of bed.
Curtis's humorous comments made me smile. I knew how cantankerously belligerent Eloise could be at the best of times.
You're not like her, Elliot. You're like a little brother to me. And going out on the lake like this is what brothers do, don't you think?
I didn't know about what brothers did or did not do together. I was a single child after all. But what I did know was that it felt remarkably good to have my older cousin confiding in me. It was wonderful that for the first time in my life he was taking me seriously. So reluctantly I agreed to go out on the lake with him. I wanted to nurture this friendship between us that was blossoming like the dogwood trees in spring. I hurriedly climbed out of bed, abandoning my pyjamas in a puddle on the floor. I put on a pair of long khaki pants, some sneakers, a sweater, and a thin windbreaker. It was early spring, so the nights and mornings were still quite chilly, and out there on the lake, with a sharp drop in temperature, it was bound to be quite cold. I stealthily followed Curtis through the cabin, like a furtive cat. He placed his fingers on his mouth, indicating for me to be very quiet. But the rebellious wooden floorboards seemed eager to betray our presence, as they belligerently creaked and groaned, as if walking on their very surfaces caused them considerable pain. We were now standing close to Aunt Claudia's bedroom. We had to be very quiet at this point. I could tell she was fast asleep. I could hear her soft breathing. I nearly jumped out of my skin when Rochester began to bark and bark and bark. I was certain the game was up, that Aunt Claudia would get up out of bed and give us our marching orders, insisting we return to bed at once. And what the hell did we mean by sneaking around the cabin at this ungodly hour of the night? I stood very still on the floor, not daring to move.
"Please be quiet, Rochester," moaned my aunt. "I'm trying to sleep."
Rochester, who clung on to my aunt like a limpet, on hearing her sharp, reprimanding tone of voice, obediently stopped barking, stretching out his paws lackadaisically, and watching us rather suspiciously through his dark eyes, as we tiptoed past my aunt's bedroom. Everything was very dark in the cabin, but with our head torches on, we could see our way clearly. Once we were outside, my heart that had been pumping a dime to a dozen began to finally slow down. I physically began to relax. I was surprised that I no longer felt apprehensive about this nightly adventure. It was exciting being out here at this time of night, under the twinkling canopy of the bright stars, that reminded me of rhinestone jewels set in an opulent velvety evening gown. The moon hung low in the sky, reflecting her silvery prisms across the lake's shimmering surface. Before long, there we were out on the lake in the rowing boat. It was so beguilingly beautiful, so peacefully tranquil. The air was crisp, sharp, and very cool. A fresh breeze spurted itself across the water, nuzzling our cheeks and whipping against our windbreakers. I could hear the pleasing trills of the crickets and frogs, and the sweet sound of the lake's water lapping against our boat. It was a snug, cosy feeling, being out here on the boat with my cousin at this crazy time, while the rest of the world remained obliviously fast asleep.
"See, I told you," said Curtis proudly. "I bet you're glad you came out with me tonight. Does it get better than this? Of course it doesn't. Now we can sit back on the boat, watching the Milky Way, waiting for the sun to rise over the horizon. And it's stunning. There's nothing like it."
I had to agree wholeheartedly with my cousin. It was thrilling to be out here in the middle of the water like this, on a boat, staring up in awe at all the constellations. I felt so remarkably privileged that Curtis had included me on this wild, wonderful opportunity that I would unlikely get to repeat again, unless, of course, I was terribly lucky. We had come a long way in our friendship, in what I considered to be leaps and bounds over the last couple of days since I'd come to the cabin. In the past, Curtis had never been terribly friendly towards me, but on this night, spent out here on the boat together, was firmly cementing our friendship still further. I was so glad I'd agreed to come on this serendipitous nightly jaunt. As I was reflecting over this, all of a sudden, I had an overwhelming feeling we were not alone. It was so disturbing that I found myself scrutinizing the shoreline, from the banks of reeds to the lofty silhouettes of the trees, with their voluptuous boughs that hovered over the lake, like bent women, reaching out for seashells. This was when I saw the tall, dark figure, with the bright yellow eyes. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I had to be. The ambiguously obscure figure stood there staring at us for a brief moment, and then disappeared through the trees. Its outline was so vague, so indistinct, so obscure, that I couldn't comprehend exactly what it was that I'd seen. In truth, I was so nonplussed, bewildered, completely confounded, too much so to actually react. Curtis, who had been rambling on about all the constellations, had been oblivious to the fact that I had not heard a single word he'd been saying. All I could hear was him talking about the Pleiades, and then about Orion, I think it was. I was surprised my cousin had not sensed that something had been watching us. Was he really that unobservant, that removed from his environment? Because someone had been watching us, and he didn't appear to have noticed a single thing. "What is wrong with you, Elliot?" my cousin asked me, looking perturbed. "You've gone as white as a ghost." "It's just something out there on the shore. It was watching us. I saw it. It had yellow eyes. It was big, very big." I trembled as I visually recalled in my mind what I'd actually seen. Curtis began to steadily laugh. "Do you really think we're alone out here on the lake, Elliot? You can't be that dim, surely. Mark my words, we're being watched all the time. The indigenous wildlife probably knows we're here. They watch us from a distance. How do you think they manage to survive? They need to be very sharp. So I guess we might have been observed by all kinds of things, raccoons, owls, foxes, deer. God only knows what has been watching us." My cousin's words brought me a huge measure of reassurance. He was right, absolutely right. We were being watched by the natural indigenous wildlife that congregated in the woods. There was nothing to be afraid of. "Look over there," said Curtis. "Don't you see it? Over there. Did you see it? It was jumping out of the water." My cousin was pointing in a westerly direction over the lake. He was enthused and animated, as if he'd seen something incredibly wonderful. I found myself growing excited. I was eager to see what he'd seen, but I couldn't see anything at all. Maybe I was looking in the wrong direction. "Where?" I asked. "Over there," said Elliot. I was leaning over the boat to inspect the water, intrigued by what Elliot said he had seen. And then I felt a hand on my back, and a sharp push, and then I was being plunged into the water. It was dark and cold. I found myself in the water, kicking my arms and legs around frantically, desperately trying to get back to the boat. Curtis was standing there on the boat, with a huge satisfactory smirk on his face. He was enjoying my terror, as I fought against the water and tried to swim back to the boat, but I didn't know how to swim. This couldn't be happening to me. Why had Curtis pushed me in the water like that? I thought he liked me. I thought I could trust him. There was no doubt in my mind, judging by the malevolent expression on Curtis's face, that he had deliberately pushed me into the water. "You're going to have to learn to swim, aren't you, cousin? All on your own, Sim. Because no one can save you now, can they? And for the record, don't think you're such a big shot catching a big catfish like you did the other day. I've caught much bigger fish than that, despite what Eloise might tell you. Good luck, cousin, out there in the dark water, all on your own. You're going to need it." Curtis began rowing the boat to shore, while I was struggling desperately to keep my head above water. If Curtis had thrown a little puppy in the middle of the lake, why had it not occurred to me that he might do the very same thing to me? My cousin did not care about me remotely. He had ruthlessly abandoned me. I was going to die out here. I was swallowing large gulps of water. It was exhausting trying to keep my head above the surface. The water was cold. It pinched right through me. I was beginning to freeze, but a tiredness was consuming me, and the panic had completely expunged my ability to actually even try to swim. I felt hopelessly defeated by the water, My heavily burdened fear expunged all my hope and overcame my instinctive ability to try and fight back. My thunderous heartbeats were so loud I could hear the blood throbbing in my ears. I grew more and more exhausted. The desire to get back to shore was overcome by an insatiable fatigue. I knew I was about to be swallowed whole by the lake, but I didn't care any more. I was just too tired to keep on fighting. I became weaker and weaker and weaker, and felt myself slipping under the surface of the water. And very suddenly, as I was about to surrender my soul to the water, a very large hand began to pull me up to the surface. I began to fight back with my plummeting energy. This was just like my nightmare I'd experienced in the early years of my life. The hand that would drag me under to my watery grave. The hand I'd regarded so bodefully in my dreams. But this hand did not pull me under. It pulled me out of the water and placed me onto a pair of ponderous shoulders, and this huge hairy thing, like a gargantuan otter, swam with me through the water to the edge of the shore. I was so dog-tired, exhausted, impoverished and drained of all my energy. I collapsed on the shore, gasping for breath. A large, generous hand pressed down on my chest, helping me to expel some of the water I'd swallowed. I began to cough, splutter and heave. And that was when I found myself staring into the dark, treacle-coloured eyes of a male Bigfoot. I realised that this ambiguous creature, with a yellow eyeshine, who had stood there under the canopy of the stars, watching me and Curtis row the boat in the middle of the lake, was the one I'd seen only earlier on. I wondered what he was thinking when he watched us. Had he seen Curtis throw me into the water? Is that why he'd come to my rescue? This clearly benevolent Bigfoot was gargantuan in size, very impressive, easily 9 foot tall, possibly more, with ponderously powerful shoulders and a nimble gait. When he climbed out of the water, he shook his hair vigorously like a shaggy dog. I think the thing that confounded me the most was how human the Bigfoot was. His primate influences could only be seen in his overlong arms, the pyramid shape of his head, and his hair-covered body. The moonlight was magnanimous. I could absorb every detail of the creature's appearance like a thirsty sponge. I knew the Bigfoot was a male before even studying his anatomy. It was just his warrior energy was so masculine, so powerful, so incredibly reassuring. I felt safe in his presence. The creature was studying me curiously, as if reading me like a book. He scratched his head pensively for a moment, and then he spoke to me in a booming voice that was so impressive that I nearly jumped out of my skin. However, I was about to be even more bewildered when the Bigfoot's words melted into my mind like chocolate, and I discovered, to my amazement, that I knew exactly what he was saying. "Manatinatola." "Are you all right?" he asked me. "I'm fine," I said, a little shocked. I was still shivering from the cold, and my hair and clothes were soaked to the skin. "Gilatena patina kulotosa, hikatila komanasavashi, homotabinastilatok, hitala kwanasaki so, hifatikanato palaki, hasikanato, hampaka sakatwa." "You cannot swim, I see. Your friend pushed you into the water, leaving you to die. How could he do this despicable thing to you? He did that to the puppy dog a while back, which I had to rescue. The poor thing was frightened out of its skin. That boy is not right in the head. His ambalanana is misaligned. I need to sort him out." I was still so numb from everything that had just transpired. I couldn't make sense of any of it. The Bigfoot threw me onto his shoulders and took me straight back to my aunt's cabin. I remember bolting into my aunt's bedroom as fast as I could. Rochester bounced off the bed and began to bark at me, and bark, as if he had no clue who I was. It was like he didn't recognise me, even though I'm sure he could have smelt me. As a result of Rochester's barking, my aunt sat up bolt upright in bed, and in the tenebrific dark shadows of the night, my bedraggled figure, with my damp clothes clinging to my body, and the pooling puddles of water in the middle of her bedroom floor, Well, I must have looked like a spectral form of some kind, from which your darkest nightmares are possibly made of. My aunt let out such a loud, discomposing scream. Eloise came dashing into the bedroom with a fire poker in her hand. "What's going on? What's going on?" she cried. I think she thought we were being burgled, and was about to bludgeon the unsuspecting criminal to death with a mighty blow. Her hands were trembling, her face ashen, her eyes as round as saucers. My aunt's eyes began to adjust to the dark shadows. She held up her hand towards Eloise to stop her from doing anything stupid. She suddenly realized it was me standing in the middle of the floor. Little Rochester was seated on the floor on his backside, looking up at me. His barking had stopped. He realized who I was. "My God, Elliot! Is that you? You're soaked to the skin," said my Aunt Claudia. "What the hell happened to you?" "Me and Curtis. We went for a row in the boat in the middle of the night. It was Curtis's idea, you see. But he pushed me into the water. He left me to drown, Aunt Claudia." My aunt was outraged. I do not think I have ever seen a woman look more angry. Her face went as white as a sheet. "I will kill Curtis when I see him. What is wrong with that boy? What did he do that for? Pushing you into the water like that? You could have drowned." My aunt began bustling around the place, getting me dry clothes to wear, rustling up some hot chocolate for me to drink. I think she believed that Curtis was stealthily hiding in the shadows, waiting for my aunt's rage to die down before he made his appearance known. My aunt was grinding her teeth and growling under her breath. "I'm going to kill Curtis," she kept saying over and over again. "I'm going to kill him. By the time I've finished with him, he'll wish to God he'd never been born." It was hours later, when Curtis had still not returned to the cabin, that my aunt's anger morphed into grievous concern. She now began to believe that something quite terrible might have happened to Curtis. I had not told her about the Bigfoot I'd encountered, not because I was deliberately keeping invaluable information from her, or because I was being evasive, but because the extraordinary events of the previous night had been so surreal. I was still trying to process them all in my head. Then I remembered the Bigfoot's ominous words. Had he not said something about sorting Curtis out, as he wasn't right in the head? My heart began to pound in my chest. I wondered if the Bigfoot may have harmed Elliot, in retaliation for cruelly throwing me in the lake, leaving me to drown. My Aunt Claudia was under the misleading impression that little Rochester had managed to safely swim to shore when he was a little puppy. She also believed I had swum to shore on my own, but she was wrong about both accounts. We would likely have drowned if it hadn't been for being rescued by a Bigfoot. Had the Bigfoot decided to do away with my cousin, me and my aunt and my cousin Eloise went marching frantically through the woodgrove, calling out Curtis's name. We found one of his shoes lying in the grass, and my aunt began to panic. She thought he might have been attacked by a wild animal. We knew he hadn't drowned in the lake, as the boat was safely parked in the boathouse. But a lone shoe lying in the woods like this was an unsettling sight indeed, one we did not want to encounter. We continued to call for Curtis, fearing the very worst and hoping for the best. But to no avail. Curtis did not appear to respond to our calls. The time we spent searching for him seemed to melt away as quickly as marshmallows over a campfire. Where the hell was he? My aunt's voice was filled with trepidation. She cried out Curtis's name until she was hoarse, but there was no sight or sound of him. "Curtis! Curtis! Curtis!" And just as we were about to give up all hope, there he was, walking nonchalantly through the woods, which I hasten to say we had so thoroughly searched. Where had he been? And why did he look so befuddled, as if he didn't have a clue where he was, and was somehow concussed, rather like someone coming around from a long anaesthetic after an operation? I studied his face closely for any sign of duplicity, a lingering smirk perhaps, a twitching at the corners of his mouth, a mischievous look in his eyes, but all I saw in his face was disorientated confusion. I thought, what the hell? There was something profoundly different about my cousin, startlingly so, which was hard to pinpoint exactly. It was a bit like putting a black sweater into the washing machine. and you put it on for a full cycle, and when you remove it, it's completely turned white. You know it's exactly the same sweater, but it has been radically altered. Curtis was like that. He looked confused as he stumbled towards us, with one foot in his shoe, while the other foot remained in a sock. It was hardly a wonder he couldn't walk straight. He was covered in leaves and looked like he'd taken a nasty fall. There were big holes in the fabric of his chinos, and his knees were badly grazed. "Where the hell have you been, Curtis?" asked Aunt Claudia. Her expression wavered from one of indignant fury to incredible relief, almost like she wanted to hug her son and kill him at the very same time. "What am I doing here? Why am I in the woods? And why are there holes in my chinos?" "Sweetheart, that's what I'd like to know. We've been worried sick about you, looking for you everywhere. I'd like you to explain yourself. Why the hell did you throw your cousin Elliot here into the lake in the early hours of this morning? What were you thinking, going out rowing in the lake anyway? And why did you do it? You knew he couldn't swim. He could have drowned, Curtis. That is so irresponsible of you." Curtis looked discombobulated, as if he'd been knocked sideways. I knew by his stupefied, rather bamboozled expression he had absolutely no memory of what he'd done, and seemed mortified that he'd thrown me into the lake. Was he acting, I wondered? If he was, he deserved an Academy Award, for he genuinely seemed very cut up about what he'd done. "I didn't, did I? I wouldn't, would I?" "You did." "But Elliot can't swim. Why would I throw him into the lake?" I studied my cousin's face very closely for any sign of duplicity, but honestly there was none. He genuinely had no memory of shoving me into the lake, and no memory of what had transpired in the woodgrove. It upset him that he couldn't remember a thing. The only thing he seemed to remember was the evening meal the night before. Another curious conundrum that happened that afternoon, soon after we found Curtis, was that the Jack Russell Rochester, who refused to go anywhere near Curtis, trotted up to my cousin and began to paw at his feet, as if he was saying, "Hello, I'm glad you're back, safe and well." That had never ever happened before. It confounded all of us. Curtis began to stroke Rochester lovingly, to tickle his tummy for him, while my aunt's eyes grew wide with amazement. She could make no sense of Rochester's behaviour. It was absurd for the dog to be giving Curtis so much attention. This had never happened before. My aunt thought Curtis might be delirious. "I think he hit his head," she told me. "That's why he can't remember a thing. I can hardly reprimand him for something he doesn't remember doing." "But why is he so different, Mum?" asked Eloise. "It's like my brother has had a complete personality transplant. It's like a darkness in him has suddenly left, don't you think?" Claudia's account. I cannot describe to you how mortified I was to wake up in the early hours of the morning, to discover my sister's son, Elliot, standing in the middle of the floor, shivering with cold, in soaking wet clothes, having been alerted to his presence by my dog's barks. I thought I was seeing a ghost, as the cabin was dark, and I was unable to see much in my bedroom, but what I saw gave me the shock of my life, until of course I realized it actually was Elliot. When Elliot told me that Curtis had thrown him into the lake, my worst fears were soon realized. It took me straight back to his childhood, when he had locked Felicity Van Riesen in the yard shed at kindergarten. I had known even as a teenager that my son had a secret dark side to his personality. It had never gone away, but had remained hidden, and his medications had suppressed his desire to pull any more insidious pranks on his friends and family. I tried to pretend it was not there, but as I had sneakily suspected, it had come back to bite me, as I knew it ultimately would. My son could have killed little Elliot by leaving him to drown in that huge lake. And like Rochester, it was a complete miracle that somehow he'd managed to be able to swim to shore. But next time, and there just could not be a next time, things might go horribly awry. I could not imagine how my sister Beryl would have reacted if I'd told her son had drowned in that lake. She might not speak to her husband Rusty from time to time, but if her son had drowned in that lake, she'd never have spoken to me ever again, and that I knew. So as soon as I got home, I had to send Curtis for further psychological evaluations, as what had transpired just could never happen again. How would I live with myself if my son was responsible for harming another human being, let alone another member of his own family? I cannot express to you the level of indignation I felt towards him. I had visions of throttling him so hard within an inch of his life for his callous attitude towards his cousin. How could he have been so insanely cruel? When Curtis did not make an appearance for several hours, I suspected he knew he was in the dog box and was keeping a safe distance from me, until my inflamed anger had cooled down. But later Curtis still had not shown up, and many hours had gone by then. We were supposed to be returning home that afternoon, so my anger was transformed into worry, like water to steam. Something dreadful must have happened to my son, but what? I searched the entire woodgrove for him and the meadows, but he was nowhere to be found. I noticed the boat was in the boathouse, so he couldn't have fallen into the lake. But then where was he? When I discovered one of my son's sweaters tangled up in some briars, and his head torch smashed to the ground, and a lone shoe lying in the grass, like any doting parent, I began to fear the very worst. Had my son been attacked by a wild animal? When I was about to call for reinforcements to search for my son, then he made an appearance, and he emerged from the woodgrove as if he'd come around from a heavily drugged state. He was disorientated, muddled, rather confused, and had no apparent memory of the entire day. I had been in the woodgrove earlier and seen no sight or sound of him, and now here he was. Where had he been? It was very enigmatic for me. For as long as Curtis had been a teenager, he'd always been impeccably dressed, but as he came out of the woods with his hair so tousled, covered in leaves, and he had round holes in the knees of his chinos and grazes on his knees, as if he had taken a nasty tumble, I wondered whether he'd hit his head really badly and completely lost his memory. But when my son came out of the woodgrove, there was a sweetness to his personality that I'd never seen before. My Jack Russell, always avoided Curtis, began to behave differently towards my son, and my son in turn exhibited a tenderness towards the dog, a tenderness that I'd never seen before. He appeared to have undergone some kind of character transformation. As we packed to go home, I climbed back in my truck, and my car rolled speedily down the driveway, and that was when I saw him. A hairy, tall, dark, ambiguous silhouette was standing there, blocking my way. I almost had a panic attack, on the spot, as what I was beholding was quite possibly the most scary thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. It was a Herculean-sized Bigfoot. I thought my heart was going to stop as the creature began to wave us down.
"That's my friend, Auntie Claudia. He won't hurt you. He's really, really nice. He's the Bigfoot that rescued me from the lake because I couldn't swim, and he told me he rescued Rochester when Rochester was a puppy."
I stopped my car. My heart jumped into my throat. My breathing was fast and furious. This powerful, lofty, majestic creature was so imposing, so daunting, so completely intimidating. To my amazement, he ran over to my driver's side door and tapped on the window with his sausage-sized fingers. It was then that I observed the creature's human-like face and genuinely concerned eyes that were both benevolent and kind, so I rolled down my window. The Bigfoot placed something rather curious in my hands. I wondered what it was. It looked to be a strange leather necklace with an eagle's feather attached to it. The Bigfoot pointed to my son, speaking in a strange language, with its meaning curiously downloaded into my head, so that I understood exactly what he was saying. I mean, how does that happen?
Matinakila mosolatwi. Ilinatiko makasa kinatola banasi. Ho kilato. Satilaniko bagina. Italakatwaki sokolansa gilasho. Hitola ba iti. Ha kulatilaso. I fixed his head for you. It was out of alignment. He needs to wear the eagle feather for the rest of the week. The dark energy will not come back. I have commanded it to go. Bad energy removed. Not his fault. Your son, good boy. Bad energy now fixed."
And with that, the Bigfoot simply turned around, glided away, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, and moving straight into the trees until he had all but gone. Eloise was sitting in the truck next to me, her mouth hanging open like a Venus flytrap.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Tell me I'm dreaming! Did that just happen? Oh my word! Oh, that was a Bigfoot! It was a Bigfoot! Wait until I tell my friends about this. They are not going to believe it.
To cut a long story short, my son Curtis has no memory of what happened to him in the woodgrove shortly after he pushed Elliot in the lake. Nor does he remember how he got into the woodgrove in the first place, or why we could never find him. But something did happen to him, to deliver him from the psychopathic tendencies he'd always exhibited, and I believe it was a Bigfoot who helped him overcome those issues of his. Suffice to say, I made him wear that eagle's feather that the Bigfoot gave us, and when my son returned to his psychologist, all his medications were removed. He was diagnosed as being a perfectly normal, healthy young man. It would seem little Rochester had found for himself a new best friend. Elliot continues to be a loving member of my family, and Eloise, although she's still hot-headed, has calmed down significantly. But some things remain unchanged. My sister Beryl and her husband Rusty still engage in their silent wars from time to time, and my sister's Beryl's spending has not been tamed at all. So some things just will never change. There you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the young woman was standing behind the glass counter at the department store. She was wearing a stylish black jacket, white cotton shirt, and black flared trousers. Her wispy brown hair was tied neatly away from her oval face in a long ponytail. This was Tina Mathis, whom I knew very well from regular visits to the department store. She offered me the most exemplary first-class service, but that's what I would naturally expect when spending a fortune on leather gloves. She smiled at me warmly. "It's so good to see you again, Miss Ellis. Why, it seems you were only here last week. Don't tell me. You can't help yourself, can you? You want another pair of my leather gloves to add to the ever-increasing collection you've got," she teased. I nodded. "I'm afraid I do. I bought my mother a pair of your leather gloves 2 months ago, I think it was, from you, if you remember. She loves those gloves. Well, she loved them. The lining was absolutely superb. The fit on her hands perfect. I think they were a vintage red colour. That's right. I regret to say they've gone walkabout. She doesn't know where she left them. She desperately needs a brand new pair. And my mother is from a very refined generation where only leather will do. I try suggesting she can get a pair of cheap woolly mitts from Old Navy or Express that don't cost a fortune. So if they get lost, it's not a train smash. She's mortified by the mere suggestion. I might as well be telling her to have tomato ketchup with French cuisine. It's a no-no for her every time." "I know," said Tina. "I do find the old generations are very strung up about their leather gloves, you know. But I hasten to say leather gloves never really did go out of fashion. Personally, they're the only gloves I will wear myself. Maybe I've been spoilt, but I hate woolen mittens. If people have the money, they'll always buy leather. But you know how it is, like glasses, scarves, gloves and stuff like that. The stuff you take off, those are the things that can so easily get lost. And when it comes to gloves, they can be dropped on the pavement, on the floor of a department store. You have no idea how many of my customers tell me they're missing just one glove. And the trouble is, if you're missing one glove, then you need to buy another pair. Otherwise, one hand will remain warm and the other will get frostbite. Now let's see how I can help you this morning, Miss Ellis. We have a fabulous glove collection at the moment and many exciting new arrivals that I'll introduce you to." Tina pulled out some beautifully presented boxes for me, wrapped in tissue paper, and showed me a vast collection of gloves. "Now we have this collection that's very popular in Harrods in London at the moment, and in Macy's they're practically walking off the shelves. They've had to place 3 more orders with the suppliers, I believe.
That's the demand for these gloves. They're made in Norway by an up-and-coming illustrious designer who has a prominent influence in the fashion world, and they're exceptionally streamlined. Your mother has small hands, doesn't she? They could be a good fit for her. I examined the gloves. They were magnificent, but I knew the price tag would be equally as magnificent, but they were for my mother. I reminded myself of all the great things she'd done for me over the years. The stunningly overpriced dress she'd brought me for the prom, and the dashing car she'd purchased me for my 21st birthday. She was worth splashing out on. "Is that your husband over there?" Tina asked me, looking at me curiously. "I had no idea you were married, Miss Ellis. You're a lucky lady. He's a handsome man. Quite a catch. Very distinguished looking. If you don't mind my saying, he looks a little bit like a fish out of water in here," she giggled. "I think men loathe hanging around women's things in a department store. It puts them on edge. The worst is the underwear section, of course. They don't want to be misconstrued for being a pervert, even if they're trying to buy their wife a present. I see it all the time. It's quite endearing, really." "I'm not married, Tina. That's why you call me Miss Ellis. That man is not my husband." "But you're not married? I thought the way he was looking at you, it just seemed so familiar." "You thought wrong, Tina. I have no idea who he is." Tina made a face and whispered, "He keeps staring at you. I wonder what he wants. It's a pity, isn't it? He looks like such a gentleman, but he's obviously a creep, isn't he?" I turned around and glanced behind me, and sure enough there was a man furtively hanging behind a long rack of women's hats, peering over at us with about as much subtlety as a rhino peeking through the undergrowth. He was hard to miss. He was over 6 foot tall, with brown spiky hair and hazelnut-coloured eyes, with attractive dimples on either side of his cheeks that could have been cute and even endearing if he hadn't been staring at me with such a fixated look that sent chills travelling down my spine. He was wearing a blue polo neck shirt and matching chinos and looked surprisingly debonair. When he realised I'd spotted him spying on me, at the very least he had the decency to flush, his skin growing so red that even the tips of his ears burned a pink colour. He hurriedly began to look through the merchandise on the shelves, pulling up a neatly folded long Burberry cashmere scarf from a shelf, which he began to examine intently. He even had the nerve to say, "Miss, how much is this scarf over here? I notice there is no price tag on it." Tina scurried over to his side and showed him where he'd find the label, to which he mumbled a "Thanks. I'll take it," he said, "but I just want to check out these hats for my mother." Tina nodded and returned to the counter with the customer's Burberry scarf in her hand, which she put to one side while she continued to attend to me. "I'm not sure he's remotely interested in the scarf, Miss Ellis," she whispered to me. "The scarf is an excuse. Still, it's a sale for me, so I'm not complaining. But he hasn't stopped staring at you, Miss Ellis." Tina was absolutely right. If this man was a private detective, he'd be an absolute disaster at his job. He'd seriously have no business whatsoever. He certainly didn't blend into his environment, but stood out like a pink chameleon that had forgotten to turn beige. "He's still watching us, Miss Ellis. He's pretending to look at stuff, but he keeps peeking over at us. Are you sure you don't know him?" "Of course I don't know him. I've never seen him a day in my life." "Just ignore him, Miss Ellis," said Tina. "He must be, you know, one of those weirdos." I roll my eyes in the back of my head. Let's not kid. He must be super weird. Tina folded up the exquisite vintage red gloves in the tissue paper inside the box, and then placed them in a very attractive paper bag, which she handed over to me with a warm smile. "It's been lovely doing business with you, Miss Ellis, as always. I do hope your mother enjoys her gloves. These ones are extra special, so make sure she knows that." "Don't I know it, Tina? They cost an arm and a leg." "But your mother's worth it, I'm sure, Miss Ellis," said Tina. "It's always a privilege to spoil our parents, is it not?" "You echo my sentiments exactly," I said. "Thanks, Tina." I grabbed my merchandise happily. "I hope I won't be seeing you too soon. No offence, of course.
If I do, you'll know unequivocally that my mother's waylaid her gloves again. Well, you know me, Miss Ellis. I'll never complain if I have another sale. It's those lost gloves that keep business booming for me, she teased. Don't be cheeky, Tina, I said, grinning, turning around to give her a wink. I glanced around the shop, glad to see that the peeping Tom that had been spying on me was walking over to the counter with a woman's Burberry hat in his hands, obviously to go with the scarf he was buying. I brushed past him as quickly as I could, doing my level best to avoid any physical contact with him. He had given me the creeps, and I hoped to never see him again. I mean, honestly, talk about the brass nerve, hiding out in a woman's section in a department store so obviously, and spying on me glaringly. Only lecherous perverts did that, surely. It could have been worse, of course. Thank God he hadn't been spotted loitering around the lingerie section, or else I really would think he was a retrobate character. The kind of sleazeball that sniffs women's undies like a drooling dog. The thought made me recoil in disgust. I made my way down the escalator, and on observing the coffee shop on the second floor, I decided enjoying a cup of dark bitter coffee might be a good idea. It always eased one's guilty conscience after parting with a sizable amount of money to indulge oneself a little. It's ironic how we self-soothe ourselves like this. I've spent a fortune, therefore I need a donut. If my mother kept losing gloves like this, I might have to take up a second job. And if I was a donut devotee, maybe be forced to enroll in Weight Watchers as well, because I'd likely be rolling out of the department store like a bouncy beach ball. The thought of the coffee warmed my heart on this cold morning in late November. I didn't fancy going out into the freezing parking lot without something warm inside my stomach. That's exactly what I needed, I thought. The caffeine would be a great pick-me-up. And come to think of it, true to form, I was slightly peckish, but I intended to stand well away from any of the tempting sweet offerings that I could smell from the top of the escalator, along with the aromatic scent of coffee beans. I sat down on one of the comfortable upholstered chairs at a round wooden table and sighed with relief. It was good to sit down, relaxing my legs and back. I fumbled around in my purse awkwardly and pulled out my cell phone to glance at the messages. There was one message from my mother to remind me that she wanted vintage red gloves. "No more of this beige stuff," the message said. "I've had enough of beige to last an entire lifetime. I need something a lot more flamboyant. Besides, red gloves are much more difficult to lose." I tapped my cell phone in response. "Not to worry, Mum. I've got your vintage gloves in red, just like you wanted. You won't be disappointed." To which she responded, "Good girl." The waitress, wearing a pink overall with a name badge which said Sophie and a white apron, came up to me with a broad smile on her face. "What can I get you?" "A black coffee would be great, along with a slice of rye with crispy bacon and avocado. That would be lovely." "Coming up," she said, scribbling down my order. "I'll be back in a mo," she said, scurrying away. I glanced around the coffee shop briefly, where cardboard cutouts of teacups and kettles dangled from the ceiling, and across the wall, embossed in decorative golden scroll, were the words, "America's Finest Coffees." The coffee shop had a happy, contented vibe, as in the background you could hear the clutter and clank of cutlery, and the elevated, rhythmic trill of people's cheerful, upbeat voices. Much like myself, there were satisfied shoppers, seated at tables, armed to the nines with swanky-looking shopping bags that boasted designer labels. These bags were hanging on people's chairs or seated upright on the floor. People were enjoying coffees together, and most of them were indulging in something wickedly sweet, I noticed. I counted 6 women tucking into the most heavenly-looking sticky cinnamon buns. The delicious smell of freshly baked pastry and cinnamon wafted all over the coffee shop. It was so intoxicating, even a hardened dieter would have difficulty in turning their nose up to such delectable temptations, unless, of course, they genuinely were a saint. It proves my theory is absolutely right, I told myself. We need a sugar rush after indulging in a huge spend, where the figures in our bank account have taken a cruel beating, and the cash notes in our purses have suddenly lost weight and thinned out significantly,
This is the kind of weight loss in life we could well do without. I continued to study the contents of my cell phone when I suddenly sensed someone was staring at me. Please, not again. It was a prickly feeling that seemed to tickle me at the back of my neck. I needed this like I needed a hole in my head. I looked up to see the man whom had been spying on me earlier on when I was buying the gloves from Tina. To my amazement, he gave me a warm, congenial smile and sanguinely ambled over to me quite confidently with an intrepid presumptuousness that took me right off my guard. Suffice to say, he dragged the opposite chair up from under the table where I was sitting and put his designer bag, that I suspect contained the Burberry scarf and hat that he'd just bought, and said, "Do you mind dreadfully if I join you?" I wanted to say, "Yes, I do mind. Would you please leave me alone? Go away." But the better, polite part of my nature nudged me in earnest, reminding me that I needed to be civil. So I gave him a watery smile and said nonchalantly, "Be my guest." But the man was already seated opposite me before I even finished my sentence. Part of me admired his bold, assertive cockiness, but another part of me recoiled at his audacious impertinence. "I noticed you when I came into the store," he said, reaching out to shake my hand. It would have been rude to refuse such a chivalrous gesture, so I took his hand in mine, conscious that mine was a little clammy. His hands were large and his handshake firm. That was a plus in his favour. I hated nothing more than a man with a limp, insincere handshake. "You were on the escalator, going up to the second floor. I'm afraid I followed you, and I apologize for that. But let me explain myself, before you think me of some kind of deranged pervert, which I assure you I am not. For the record, I do not do this sort of thing, follow women around for no reason at all. Believe it or not, I'm usually quite shy, rather reserved in nature. My name is Morris, by the way. People call me Mop for short." He smiled at me, raising a dark brow above his grey eyes. "I think it's because when I was a young boy, my hair was always long, incredibly messy. My mother called me Mop, and the name just stuck. Everyone calls me that now. I'm not sure I like it, but I've got used to it over the years." "Well, your hair's not exactly messy now, is it? So I'm not sure Mop suits you. You're very well presented, I have to say. So perhaps you should look for an alternative name." "My name is Katia Ellis." "It's a pretty name, Katia, and thanks for that," he said, touching his hair. "I do try not to live up to my name, and keep the hair relatively short and spiky. But regretfully, no one calls me Spikes. That would be a step up from being called Mop, don't you think? Even Hedgehog could be quite nice." I smiled. The man's humour was quite sweet. "I just want to say, I did not mean to stare at you so much. But you are the doppelganger for my late wife. When I saw you, I thought, I thought I was seeing her ghost. I mean, the two of you could be twins. That's why I was staring at you so inappropriately, and I do apologize profusely for that. I cannot think what you must have been thinking. How rude I must have appeared. In truth, I was completely confounded." The man fumbled around in his pocket of his chinos, and he opened up a leather wallet, removing a photograph from one of the back pockets, which he pulled out to hand to me. "Just so you know, I'm not spinning you a tall yarn, and that you might appreciate my reaction upon seeing you. This is a photograph of my late wife, Crystal," he said. "Her name was Crystal Jenner." I nearly did a double take as I glanced down at the photograph he handed me. If I did not unequivocally know that the picture was not me, I might have suspected it actually was. My fingers trembled as I handed him back the photograph. It was unnerving to see someone that could so easily have been myself staring back into the lens of a camera, who looked so much like me. His wife had shoulder-length brown hair like I did, brown hazel-colour eyes, with a small little pixie face. Even the way the woman smiled with a slightly lopsided crooked grin was exactly like me.
Now you can see what I'm talking about. Can you see the striking resemblance between you and my wife? Morris asked me. It's extraordinary, is it not? When I saw you, well, I nearly keeled over in shock, he said, grabbing his chin, and his eyes growing moist. I thought you were her. I really did. Isn't it crazy? The likeness was uncanny, almost impalpable. And you dress like her, too. She always wore cashmere jumpers and smart pants like you do, when she was out and about on the town. At home, she was happy to lounge around the place in sweats. She liked to wear comfortable stuff.
Well, I suppose she does look a little like me, I lied. I didn't want him to know how shaken up I was about the photograph. In the circumstances, I could not blame him for staring at me. My father had died 3 years ago, and I wondered how I would behave if I saw someone looking identical to him wandering around a department store. Would I be able to stop myself from following the man around like a lapdog? Probably not. Not until I was absolutely certain it wasn't my father, even though he was long since dead. I could hardly blame this man, who'd lost his wife, to be gravitating towards me like a drooling dog. He probably missed her dreadfully, and being reminded of her so cruelly in another living soul who mirrored his wife could not be easy to digest. It was a piercing, sharp reminder of his loss. Life could be hard at the best of times, and being reminded of things we'd sooner not focus on, well, that was tough, wasn't it? I admitted to myself I had been unkind about this stranger, jumping to conclusions about him that were unjustified. By all intents and purposes, he was probably a decent human being, wounded by the blows that life had dealt him, like most of us that have our little crosses to bear.
A little? Are you joking? When Crystal was alive, I remember she told me once that she had read somewhere that everyone in the world has a double, but I never believed that for a moment, until now. But I'm looking at my wife's double. It's a pity you two never got to meet. I think you would have been convinced that in some way you had to be related.
I'm really sorry to hear about your wife. How... He studied me through his steely grey eyes.
You mean how did she die?
I nodded and shook my head solemnly. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, don't worry about me. It's none of my business. It really isn't. I shouldn't have asked.
It was a hit and run. A car just ran over her, he said.
I could see the sadness flicker in his eyes, and my heart leapt in my chest in empathy. The man was no creep, but a grieving widow, who was pining after the loss of his beloved, and seeing me, almost a replica of his own wife, must have punched the wind out of his sails, and for that I almost regretted coming to the department store today. I had been a catalyst that had ripped off the plaster of an old wound, and made it bleed all over again. I gasped, locking my hands over my mouth. I'm so sorry to hear that. That's terrible. Did they find out who killed her, or did the offender get away?
The man nodded bleakly. 16-year-old boy he was, drunk out of his skull. His girlfriend had broken up with him. He was heartbroken. He drank his parents' entire liquor cupboard and drove around town, highly intoxicated. He actually drove into someone's wall, which was fortunate as others might have been randomly killed by him. Thankfully he was unscathed, which was miraculous in itself, although his car was a complete write-off. The young man was rushed to hospital, nearly died himself. He had to have his stomach pumped. The alcohol in his system could have killed a rhino, I was told. I actually felt grievously sorry for him. But I'm sorry, when you're drunk, you don't get into a car and drive, do you?
No, you don't, I reflected. But you know how it is, especially when you're young and callow and not emotionally mature. Dealing with hurt is a greater challenge then. Not that I'm standing up for the 16-year-old boy, of course, but when you are very, very sad, and on top of it all still so young and innocently naive, you do so many stupid things, don't you? I remember when my first boyfriend broke up with me when I was 16 years old. I was a complete mess, I was. I broke a couple of my mother's best crystal vases. She never forgave me for that. I just threw them on the floor and smashed them in the cold light of day. I'd never have reacted so adversely in normal circumstances, but my grief, it was so profound. I lashed out in anger, and the vases were in the firing line of my wrath. I know it was a stupid thing to do, to pick up an object that had no connection to my loss, but I needed to lash out at something, and I took it out on those vases. It was like a pressure cooker of frustration was building up inside of me, and I didn't know how to handle the pain. I've never done anything like that before or since, but my heart was broken. I felt completely decimated, as if someone had flung a wrecking ball at my life. I never thought I'd get over Nicholas Sedgerow. That was his name. Needless to say, my mother was livid. I had destroyed her water-fed crystal vases. She never let me forget that either. In the end, I bought myself a punching bag. I put my boyfriend's face on it and punched it until I was exhausted. And 3 weeks later, my boyfriend came crawling back out of the woodwork, begging me for forgiveness, telling me he'd made a dreadful mistake and that he didn't fancy Alison Bonnet after all. It was me he wanted, and me he loved, and he wanted me back. And let me guess, you told him to take a leaping jump, said Morris, unable to disguise the amused twitch at the corner of his mouth. I laughed. Something like that. I think after someone dumps you, it's hard to let that go. Maybe I'm too proud. Forgiveness is probably an issue for me. My boyfriend had dumped me for someone else. And how do you ever get over that? It eats away at you. And if he's done it to you once, well, he's likely to do it to you again, if he's tempted enough. I can be quite proud, and that's probably my quintessential problem. I was offended that he had left me for someone else. Suffice to say, I have no regrets on that score, that we never got back together again. I was privately realizing, as I was talking to Morris, that I was sharing too much with the stranger. I didn't want to give him the wrong impression, or make him falsely assume I was interested in him, but he was easy to talk to, and I kind of liked him. Here we are, said the waitress, your tuna and bacon on rye, and your coffee, she said, putting it in front of me. I'll have the same, said Morris. When the waitress was gone, he said, Do you know if my wife was in a coffee shop? She'd order black coffee and avocado toast with bacon like you have done. It's quite uncanny. Tell me about yourself. What do you actually do? I very much doubt that me and your wife are alike beyond our appearance, Morris. I know you must be missing her dreadfully. But if I can give you a word of advice, don't go looking for someone exactly like her to replace her, because you'll be bitterly disappointed. It really is a fluke I look like her. But beyond that, I doubt that I'm remotely like your late wife. You really should let her go. I know it's none of my business. It's just, friendly, well-meaning advice, because dwelling on your pain, well, it can be so cutting and so soul-destroying, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Well, why don't you convince me that you are nothing like my late wife? Tell me all about yourself. I'm very interested. I felt slightly uncomfortable, sitting there in the chair at a coffee shop, being surveyed by a man who clearly wanted me to be his wife. He had that hope in his eyes, as if a dying ember within him had been switched right back on and revived, as if he had a chance of resurrecting the dead woman he had loved for so long, by finding a replacement that might mimic his beloved. But there was no way. I was going to be his wife's successor. Not a chance in hell. Look, I'm not sure this is a good idea, Morris, I said, sipping my coffee with a measure of reluctance. I mean, it's very good to meet you, but I don't know what you want from me. And I don't mean to be unkind, but I am not your dead wife. I really am sorry about your loss. I really am. And losing your wife under such devastating circumstances makes my heart break for you. It really does. And I'm sorry if I remind you of her. I can't imagine what that must be like for you, but— No buts, he said, reaching out to pat my arm, which I nearly pulled away, but I simply couldn't do it. That might be too much like a slap in the face for a man hurting so much. I didn't have the heart to cause him more pain.
Why don't you tell me about yourself, Katiana? Are you married?
No, I recently broke up with my fiancé. It wasn't working out, you see.
I'm sorry to hear that. How long were you together?
About 5 years.
I'm sorry to hear things didn't work out as I said, given that you were engaged.
I'm not sorry. I'm glad things went pear-shaped, actually. We weren't right for each other, you see, but we never admitted it to ourselves. But just so you know, I'm not looking for a relationship.
Well, neither am I, said Morris. My wife's death cut me to the quick. I don't think I shall ever marry again. I miss her dreadfully. You can't replace someone like that. My friends keep telling me to meet someone else, and even if that person does not tick all the boxes for me, that it shouldn't be a train smash, that I should be willing to just settle, so that I don't have to be alone for the rest of my life. But I refuse to settle. I would rather live alone, and I think that will ultimately be my fate. And you know what? I'm all right with that. I've accepted it. I consider myself to have been so privileged and fortunate to be married to Crystal. Such a wonderful woman, even if it was all too short.
I know exactly what you mean. I agree with you about the not settling part. Relationships are never easy. After my dad died, well, my mother has never dated anyone since, and she doesn't want to either. She's quite happy living on her own, you know. She lives with my grandmother, and after I broke up with my fiancé, I moved in with them. I was meaning to move out, actually, but it got quite comfortable at my grandmother's place. It's the 3 of us together. It's fun living with 3 generations under one roof, and we all get along famously, so it makes sense we live together, like the Golden Girls, but in different generations, of course. My grandmother recently bought a cottage in the countryside, not far from here, and it's idyllic. She keeps chickens, owns a couple of ponies, even though she doesn't ride. She loves animals, you see.
Sounds quite lovely, said Morris, thanking the waitress, who put down his avocado toast and black coffee.
You like black coffee? I asked, surprised.
No, I can't stand it, actually, he said, pushing it over to me. How about you drink it for me? I just ordered what you did. Forgot about the coffee. Forgot that you chose black. But the avocado toast, that I will thoroughly enjoy.
I realized I was enjoying the company of this man, but he had so much baggage and was grieving the death of his late wife. I knew it wouldn't be wise to see him again. His heart had been broken badly once, and I didn't want to be responsible for breaking it twice, when he realized I was not his wife come back from the grave, and never would be. Beyond that, I wanted to meet someone myself in the future who liked me for myself alone, and didn't want me in their lives because I bore an uncanny resemblance to someone they'd once loved, and they hoped that in some way I might fill their shoes. That's hardly a healthy way to start a relationship. It reminded me of a dog that my mother lost so tragically about 10 years ago. It was a golden retriever called Mr. Stoutman, who just dropped down dead one day at the grand old age of 15, without any explanation whatsoever, when only moments before he'd been fine. They never did find out what was wrong with Mr. Stoutman, but given his age, it was a good way for an old dog to die. It meant he never got to the stage where he had to be euthanized, which in itself was a remarkable blessing. My mother had been devastated, and then she found another golden retriever that looked exactly like Mr. Stoutman, whom she believed would replicate her deceased dog. But the physical similarities were the only thing those 2 dogs had in common. Don't get me wrong, the new golden retriever she owned, called Mr. Pickle, well, he was a legend unto himself, but he was definitely not a carbon copy of Mr. Stoutman. In the end, my mother had to wisely concede that every person, human being, animal, and plant on this fabulous planet of ours is uniquely different, which is what makes us special. But carbon copies? No, they don't even exist. I would hedge a bet that the same is true of clones. I remember a while back they made a clone of Dolly the sheep. It was splashed all over the New York Times, but I unequivocally doubt that on the personality side of things that those 2 sheep were remotely alike. So I have to say I was wary of this man, sitting opposite me, who could deny to me until the cows came home that he didn't want a relationship with me. But there was no mistaking the hope I saw in his eyes. I could read his body language, and it was obvious to me that he was attracted to me. How did I feel about him? Well, I wasn't exactly sure. He was handsome enough and very attractive, with a fabulous sense of humour, but he carried such a large torch for his late wife. How could anybody hope to compete with that? And I didn't even want to try, and could you blame me for that?
"When am I going to see you again, Katiana?"
he asked me eagerly, when I got up from my seat, hurriedly grabbing my fancy cardboard bag and making mutterings under my breath that I needed to go. "It was good to meet you, Morris, it really was. As I was saying, I'm so sorry about what happened to your late wife, and sorry for giving you a shock today, for reminding you of her. But I wish you all the best in the future, and I don't think seeing you again is a good idea in the circumstances. And besides, I'm not looking for a relationship myself." Morris pressed a card in my hand.
"Call me if you change your mind. I don't know about you, but I felt a definite spark between the two of us, which has nothing to do with you looking remotely like my wife. I want to assure you of that."
I didn't believe him. I reluctantly took the card from him, tossing it into my purse, knowing full well that I'd never phoned this man. There were some ships that went past you in the night, and it was best to leave it that way. 1 year later, it had been an exhausting afternoon at the Alice in Wonderland boutique in town, where I was working as the manager of an up-and-coming clothing store. The name was borne about by the really unusual collection of clothes that were so ethereal and lightweight, made from stunningly high-quality fabrics that some would describe as dreamy, hence the name. I was about to close up the store in the late afternoon, when a customer ran up to the boutique, clearly out of breath. I'm so sorry. I know it's awfully late, but do you mind dreadfully if I take a quick peek? I've been driving past your boutique every day, and let's just say I've been meaning to look at your stuff. It's so individualistic, so bohemian. I love that. I loathe the status quo, or the traditional predictable designs. They bore me rigid. When I go to a function, I like to know that no one else will be wearing a dress quite like me. And these clothes of yours would make any woman, regardless of size, feel like a princess, I'm quite sure. She'd be able to make her own statement. Well, they're meant to flatter all figures, I told her. Please, I said, with a warm, upbeat gesture, take as long as you like. I'm in no rush to get closed. That's kind of you to say. They're meant to flatter all figures, I told her. Please, I said, with a warm, upbeat, friendly gesture, take as long as you like to look around. I'm in no rush to get closed. That's awfully kind of you. Wait a minute, she said to me. Don't I know you? Were you not at Charleston School of Arts? I think I was in your class. Do you remember me, Fiona Duncan? You're Katiana Ellis, am I right? I was floored. The last time I'd seen Fiona, well, she didn't look like this. The ugly duckling had turned into a swan. I never envisaged such a plain Jane at school, with her thick bottle glasses and dull mousy hair, would ever turn out to look like this. The woman was now boasting bouncy hair that was highlighted, and her brown eyes, without those god-awful glasses, were so pretty. At school, Fiona had been one of my very best friends, as she'd always been a barrel of laughs, and I'd thoroughly enjoyed hanging around her. You are Fiona Duncan, I said. No, you aren't. You can't be. I am, Fiona. You look incredible. Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say. You don't look so bad yourself. The two of us threw our arms around each other excitedly. Oh, I've got so much to tell you, said Fiona. I've been married twice over, would you believe it? I'm still with husband number 2, thankfully. How do you feel about going to one of the bars in town, having a meal and a lovely long chat? You're not too busy, are you? She asked obsequiously. Or should we do it another day, if you like? But it's just so good to see you after all this time. It's been so long, far too long if you ask me. How can I possibly refuse? I said. Even if I did have a prior engagement, I'd cancel them, because it's fabulous to see you. Oh, I am so pleased to hear you say that, Katiana. You have no idea how thrilled I am to see you again. And I'm quite sure you've got so much to tell me. And likewise, there is so much to tell you. This is going to be fun. Let's go. I don't know how long me and Fiona sat there in the bar in town talking, but we were so engrossed and absorbed in each other's conversations that if people had been dancing around us stark naked, or smashing plates on the floor like at a Greek family wedding, I can honestly tell you this, I probably wouldn't have noticed a thing. It was as if in that moment all that mattered was what Fiona Duncan had to tell me, and everything else just faded into the background, as if it was of very little significance. I only had one glass of wine because I was driving. I barely even ate my meal that I ordered. It was too exciting to reconnect with my old friend. Food was the last thing on my mind. I hasten to say Fiona and me were almost kicked out of the bar, as people had long since left. It was 12:30 at night. I was stunned to discover that the bar was completely empty of all its inhabitants. Everybody had just vanished, and I hadn't even noticed a thing. It was a little like being robbed by thieves in the middle of the night, and you wake up in the morning to discover everything around you has been taken, without your knowledge. "I don't normally close up my premises so late," the friendly bar manager told us, "but I sensed you two had a lot of catching up to do, as the two of you have been so absorbed in each other all evening. I sent the waitress over to you a few times to ask you if you wanted anything more to drink, and neither of you even noticed her. She said to me, 'Those are old friends who haven't seen each other in years,' and believe me, I know what that is like. I'm very happy for you getting together after all this time, but now I really must insist you go, or the wife will kill me when I get back. She's always telling me I'm too soft on the punters." "Don't be a stranger," said Fiona, throwing her arms around me and giving me a big kiss on the cheek. "It's been amazing seeing you again, Katiana. Call me, please," she said, making a gesture of a telephone at her ears. "I've someone I would so love you to meet. The two of you would be so good together." "Don't worry about me," I assured her. "I'm footloose and fancy-free, and I have no intention of getting embroiled in a relationship any time soon. But thanks for the thought anyway. You'll change your mind when you meet my friend. He's quite the charmer, I can assure you." "I don't think so," I said, shaking my head. "It's been good to see you, Fiona. Don't forget to pop around to the boutique. I'll give you a 20% discount." "I'll hold you to that, Katiana," she teased. I trotted out of the bar, feeling both exhilarated but exhausted. Let's just say reconnecting with an old friend again after such a long time was very thrilling indeed, but also incredibly tiring. I felt as if I had been flung on a roller coaster ride at a fairground, and now that I was acclimatizing, after being tossed around the place like the rice in a rattle, I felt like I wanted to just drop. I knew when I got home I was going to flop back on the bed like a rag doll and be out for the count. I trudged over to my car, my legs feeling heavy beneath me, like blocks of cement, my walking laboured, my posture slouched, and my eyelids drooping. If indeed anyone happened to be watching me, they would likely think I was inebriated or bladdered, but let me tell you, fatigue can resemble drunkenness at times. I opened up the driver's side door and sank back gratefully into the leather seat, with a thankful sigh. I closed my eyes and was tempted to go straight to sleep, but that would not be a good look, falling asleep in a parking lot like this. I needed to drive back home, down some of those dark country roads, and this was something I did not appreciate doing. I avoided driving at night whenever I possibly could. I didn't mind driving at night normally in areas where everything was lit up by street lights, but the area where my grandmother lived was very dark, without any street lights, so for miles around, the only light to illuminate my path would be that of the moon and, of course, my car headlights. I sat in my car for a brief moment, reflecting rather soberly on the night's events, and how fabulously good it had been to see Fiona Duncan again after all these years. I was about to start up my engine when a tall, ambiguous but shadowy figure appeared to be standing outside my car, and then leaning towards me and ramming on the window. I wanted to scream, "Go away! Leave me alone!" but I politely wound down my window to see who it was.
"Hello, Katiana. Do you remember me? It's Morris. We met a year ago in the department store. You were buying gloves for your mother. I told you that you looked like my late wife. I saw you in the bar earlier on. I'd been waiting for you in the car to have a word. I knew I couldn't speak to you and get a word in edgeways. You were caught up in a conversation with some other woman. So I knew once you'd parted ways with her, I might just get a chance to have a word, so to speak. I thought of you a great deal over the last year, hoping I would bump into you like this. This must be serendipitous. I was wondering."
"I'm sorry, Morris. I need to go. I'm exhausted." I knew I was being rude, but I really didn't care. I was dog-tired, and politeness had abandoned me, as my body had other priorities right now, and sleep came first on my menu. I knew I would regret being rude to this kind man. And right now, this annoying man was a mosquito. Why wouldn't he leave me alone? I closed my window abruptly, putting my foot down on the accelerator. My car moved away. Morris was waving me down frantically in the car lot. He was opening his mouth like a goldfish and saying something, but I willfully ignored him. I carried on with my foot on the gas, and I accelerated out of the car lot as fast as I could. When I glanced out of my visor mirror, I could see I was being shadowed by another car, flashing its lights at me to get my attention. I knew it was Morris. He wanted me to stop, probably so he could get my phone number, and we could go out sometime. That's why he'd been waiting for me in the parking bay at the bar, until I finally parted company with Fiona Duncan. I wasn't interested. I told him that a year ago. Nothing had changed since then. Could he not get the message? "Leave me alone, will you?" I growled under my breath in exasperation. For a long while Morris's car followed me, but then it thankfully went away, taking a left-hand fork in the road and disappearing from my sight. Thank God he'd finally got the message. Was he really that dim? I sighed with relief, as I'd finally got him off my tail. I was exhausted now. I could barely keep my eyes open. My lids kept shutting like the blinds on a window. I was cursing myself for not having the wisdom and foresight to order a coffee from the bar in town before I embarked on my journey. The caffeine would almost certainly have helped fight off the sluggish exhaustion that was consuming me right now. My father had always warned me it was dangerous to drive when you were fatigued, and could almost be as threatening as driving drunk. And his warning words resonated with me right now. I felt as if I was ready to just drop like a flower in the valley that buckles over and surrenders itself to the earth. I was on the precarious part of my journey, driving through a heavily wooded area where both sides of the roads were crowded with ubiquitous tall lofty trees that stretched back for many miles. I don't mind admitting that this was the stretch of the journey that I dreaded every time. It was these back roads in South Carolina that would leave me closing the doors of the boutique early in the winter, as I dreaded driving in the dark. It was navigating these roads at night which made me wonder whether living in my grandmother's country cottage was a wise decision at all, and was worth the trouble. It would be so much easier renting an apartment in town. This desolate, remote country road seemed to close in on me claustrophobically from every side, as if the trees themselves were going to reach out and grab me from my car with their gnarled boughs. It seemed so bodefully menacing, and the dark, inauspicious shadows that moved through the trees left ominous suggestions on my imagination that I did not want to entertain. There could be anything out there, hiding among those trees. It was insufferably tenebrous, and I tried to focus on the road ahead, where my headlights pierced through the velvet blackness with their bright beams of light. But if I merely glanced even briefly at the trees on the side of the road, that were like ambiguous hooded giants. It felt as if they were about to pounce at me from the dark shadows. Then I would begin to panic. I kept closing my eyes tightly and very nearly slipping off to sleep. On one occasion I very nearly went ploughing into a tree. It was then that I realized that my exhaustion had completely defeated me. If I did not surrender to it, I could end up in a very nasty, possibly tragic car accident. I knew that the only sensible thing to do in the circumstances was to pull over to the side of the road and climb into the back seat to have a sleep. I toyed with the idea of phoning my mother to ask her to pick me up, but I couldn't get her up at this late hour and expect her to negotiate her way down a dark country road like this, when she also hated driving at night. That would be an unkind thing to do. I fumbled around awkwardly in my purse and retrieved my cell phone. I left my mother a message, even though I doubted she was awake to actually receive it. But I didn't want her to worry about me unnecessarily. "Staying overnight in town," I wrote. "See you in the morning." I certainly did not want to tell her the truth, that I was going to sleep on the side of the road. She would have been mortified if she knew that. I can assure you, in every other eventuality, I would have done my level best to get away from this desolate, remote, isolated road, and get home as quickly as I could. But I did not care a toss any more. That is what exhaustion does for you. It defeats the tormenting demons that normally plagued me when I drove down this long, lonely stretch of road at night. But my fear was placed on a back burner, and had no power to wrestle with my deflated body, that was physically far too worn out to give a damn. I could have slept in a dumpster for all I cared. I pulled over to an ideal little pebbled clearing on the side of the road, sighing with relief. This was the perfect spot for me to park. And even if it wasn't, I wasn't going to trouble myself with such obscure, insignificant considerations. I thankfully climbed over onto the back seat, which was soft and comfortable. The malleable leather was cool to the touch, swaddling my body like a refreshing shower. I groaned appreciatively, closing my eyes. Luckily it was summer, so it wasn't cold, and the moment I hit the seat, I was out like a light. For beyond closing my eyes, I remember nothing more. I'm not sure how long I slept for, but I awoke feeling slightly refreshed, but very disorientated. My car was wobbling around precariously, and I was shaking, jolting, and banging around inside it like a plum in a Tupperware container. What the hell was going on? I sat up with a start. Where was I? I wiped away the cloying sleep from my eyes and let out a sizable yawn. Was this a dream? It had to be. But no, it wasn't. My car was moving on its own accord, as if it had become a gurney in the ICU, and I had become the long-suffering patient. My car was not on the ground any more. Something or someone was carrying my car. I peered through the windscreen windows and through the gloomy glaze of the dark night. I could see the ambiguous silhouettes of something monstrously big, with ponderous shoulders and huge arms, carrying my car from the front. And another gargantuan being was carrying me from the rear side of the car. You have got to be kidding me. What the hell was going on? My heart thundered against my chest wall so violently, I thought it would explode. My blood was running freezing cold. I felt like a live sardine trapped in a can that needed to get the hell out of the can before it got eaten alive. I opened up the driver's side door, jumping out of the car, running away as fast as I possibly could. But my legs felt like heavy lumps of cement beneath me. My ankles twisted at awkward angles as my feet hit the gravel road. The shoes I was wearing were grossly impractical. I pulled them off my feet, throwing them onto the ground. In my bare feet I ran across the road towards the tall gathering of trees. They were my only hope. I could hear the sound of my car being dropped onto the ground with a powerful, clattering, clanging sound, like two metal drums being banged against each other. I heard heavy feet pounding after me, giving me chase. The ground heaved as these beings pursued me. It was like the monsters from my childhood that I believe lay in wait for me under my bed, had now taken on human form. They had morphed into my reality. This could not be happening to me. I was gripped by an unquenchable fear that antagonized every single cell in my entire body, that was screaming for mercy, but no one came to my help. Everything seemed so surreal, as if I'd woken up in an alternative Jurassic Park-type reality, where dinosaurs loomed around and popped out from you at every corner, waiting to tear you apart, limb from limb. Oh my God! Something was going to eat me. I just knew it. I had to get the hell out of here, and the only way of escape was through these trees. But it was so pitch black, so menacing, so inhospitable, so unfriendly. I could barely see where I was going. Even my hands before my face seemed to just disappear in front of my very eyes, because I couldn't even make out my fingers. I glanced over my shoulders, and I could see 2 pairs of yellow eyes blazing through the darkness, and tall, lofty silhouettes of the most Herculean-sized creatures that I have ever discerned in my life. My heart felt as vacuously hollow and empty, like an Easter egg. My mind was a whirl, with only one thought in occupancy, and that was to run, run, and run. My adrenaline steadily coursed through my blood, and I knew what it felt like to be an elk pursued by a mountain lion. This was no fun. I could almost see my life flashing before me. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to die. I had so much to live for. I ran through this dark abyss. The wood grove was dark, ambiguous, a void full of treacherous stumbling blocks that were desirous to trip me up at every turn. My breathing was fast and furious. The only way to describe it is I didn't have a clue where the hell I was going. I couldn't see a thing. That was how dark the wood grove was. I was clumsily bumping into trees, tripping over ferns, shrubs, and angry gnarled roots that pushed themselves through the ground like hungry hands that wanted to grab me. My bare feet did me no favours, as spikes pierced through my feet, causing me instant pain. But I was oblivious to it. I had to get away. I had to find somewhere to hide, or whatever was after me would eat me alive. That was when I found a hedge of brambles. I didn't care about the obtrusive, sharp, jagged, unfriendly spikes that might cut me to shreds. But they could also protect me from these 2 predators that were pursuing me. My skin teared, almost like the ladders in a pair of tights. But I was oblivious to the pain. As I crawled hurriedly under the bush, my heart was close to the ground, beating and pounding furiously. And that was when I heard them. They were standing only yards away from me. The next thing I knew is this huge thorny bush of briars was shredded away from above me, as if it was merely a feather. I found myself looking up into the eyes of 2 powerful, lofty creatures. I froze to the spot, unable to move. I was so afraid. And then a booming voice spoke to me in a strange, curious language. It was powerful and authoritative, warm and kind. The words plunged into my head like water from a forceful faucet, and then the meaning of the words seemed to dive into my mind so seamlessly.
Matilani kalinokwa, o masilakinakwa, holinitilaki la mikolono soninaki, hizali kaliko masa. Why are you so afraid? We have no intention of hurting you. We did not mean to scare you. I'm sorry we woke you up. You were sleeping over a portal. We had to move you.
In a second, my fear abandoned me, as my eyes now focused on the 2 lofty, majestic creatures, and I suddenly knew exactly what they were. They were both Bigfoot, and close up and personal, under the shimmering light of a pearly moon that audaciously cut through an open branch. I saw that although very intimidating, they were possibly the most benevolent creatures I have ever encountered. What do you mean by portal? I asked them.
Hinatilakina hokwani sakishana holinaginaquo amasilakina omonakinalita sikashakwana. You don't know what a portal is? The Bigfoot asked me. It's an opening into another world, into another realm. If you fell through the portal, we might not get you back. The land has energy fields. You parked your car bang in the middle of a very vibrant portal. We were concerned for your safety. I know that your eyes are not accustomed to the dark, so let us both show you your way safely back to your car.
The female Bigfoot rushed up to me. She was examining my scratches. Pukola! Oh, Mokola! Ilitani! Oh, Gosha! Look at you, she said, shaking her head furiously. You've been cut to shreds. I tell you what, get onto my shoulders. I'm not sure, I stammered awkwardly. Akiko! Matalaki! I won't bite, said the female Bigfoot. I'm here to help you. I'll be fine, I insisted. But when, after a few more thorns pierced through my feet, I reluctantly agreed to climb onto the Bigfoot's shoulders. It was strange. She smelt like my mother's tabby cat, Ernest, who was forever rolling in the dust. It was an earthy smell that was not unpleasant. The female Bigfoot, with the grace of a ballerina, and with her powerful feet, she thundered across the woodgrove like a herd of bison over the American plains. She moved with a rhythmic fluidity. Her movements were serene, like a boat bobbing across the water, and I began to giggle as I held on to her long dark hair. I almost felt like a kid again, and when we reached the car, I don't mind admitting I was a tad disappointed. I didn't want this ride to end. The Bigfoot finally lowered her body so I could climb off her. She stared at me earnestly through her kind, dark eyes. The moonlight began to cut through the trees, washing itself generously over the Bigfoot's human-like face. And in that moment, I was struck by how incredibly kind she was. The male Bigfoot and the female Bigfoot stood together, like a salt and pepper cellar on a table, watching me as I got into my car and started up my engine. "Thank you," I called out to them. "Thank you very much." They stood there in the middle of the road, watching me drive away, until they were all but ants on the landscape. When I got back home and opened the cottage door, my mother came rushing over to me, looking as belligerent as a Rottweiler on a bad hair day. "Where the hell have you been? I've been worried sick. You never returned home from the boutique, and you've been gone for ages and ages. I thought something dreadful had happened to you." "Mum, I sent you text telling you that I was fine." "No, you didn't," she insisted. "I did," I said, retrieving my cell phone from my purse to show my mother. I realised to my horror I'd sent my messages to Fiona Duncan instead of my mother. "Look at you," said my mother. "You're covered in blood and scratches. What the hell happened to you?" "Mum," I said, "if I told you, you would never believe me." 3 weeks later, I was incredibly frustrated. I was looking forward to having dinner with Fiona Duncan and her husband Theo. Of course I was. But I wish to God she wasn't so intent on setting me up with some stranger. I wasn't interested in getting involved with anyone. But Fiona was so sweet. I didn't have the heart to turn down her kind invitation. That would be so graceless. It had taken a long while for the scratches on my face and arms to finally heal. But when I looked in the mirror, my face no longer looked all scratched up. I had told anyone who'd asked me that I'd fallen into a hedge of brambles. I'm quite sure they were wondering how anyone would end up tangled in a hedge of briars, but even though they gave me funny looks, they didn't ask me any awkward questions. I arrived at Fiona's house in a green leafy neighbourhood in Tega Cay, which is in York County in South Carolina. She lived in a very attractive modern-looking home with her husband. I was wearing a little black dress and a pair of low-heeled, strappy sandals. My feet had not fully recovered yet from my run in the woodgrove. They still hurt on occasion. "Oh, there you are, Katiana, darling. How lovely it is to see you." said Fiona, throwing her arms around me. "Now let me introduce you to Morris. Morris, meet Katiana." I stood there in absolute astonishment. As I stood there staring at Morris, the man I'd first encountered in the department store when I was buying leather gloves for my mother. "Hello, Morris," I said rather shyly. "How are you?" "I'm fine," he said. "And how are you?" "Well," I said. "You know each other?" asked Fiona, looking befuddled. "But I don't understand."
We have met each other a few times," Morris admitted. "Well, twice, to be exact. Katiana here bears a remarkable resemblance to my late wife."
"Really?" said Fiona. "I had no idea." "I'm so sorry," I said. "About the other night, I mean. How rude I was 3 weeks ago. I was so exhausted. I met up with Fiona here for the first time in years, and when you came knocking at my windscreen, I was not in the mood to engage in any social niceties. It wouldn't have mattered who you were, I'm afraid. I'm a bear with a sore head when I'm tired. I can become cantankerous and moody."
"It was Fiona you met up with in the bar?" asked Morris, shaking his head. "I didn't even recognize her. If I had, I would have asked her for your number and contacted you myself. I suppose when I observed you in the bar talking to a woman, I didn't focus on the woman that was with you. I tried to get your attention, but you were so caught up in an animated conversation. So that was why I waited in the car lot for you, to part ways. I know that sounds really predatory of me, but I was so worried I wasn't going to see you again, and I had no way of knowing how to contact you. I did not want you to slip through my fingers like butter again, so that's why I pounced on you when you came out of the bar. I did not mean to harass you, and I apologize profusely for that. I also should not have followed you in the car like I did. I wanted to tell you, Katiana, that yes, you do look like my late wife, but I would like to get to know you for yourself, not because you look like her. That was what I wanted to say. I think there was a definite spark between the two of us. It seems a shame not to explore that spark, to see where it takes us. I would be grateful if you would consider coming out with me for a few times, to see where we go to from here."
"I'll think about it," I told him. "Oh, my word," said Fiona, looking at Theo with bright eyes. "I think I'm in the wrong profession, sweetheart. I was meant to be a professional matchmaker. I saw these two in my mind as suiting each other. I think they're meant to be together." 2 years later. 2 years had swept by at the speed of light, and I couldn't believe that I was married to Morris Jenner, and I'm glad he loved me for myself alone, and not because I resembled his late wife. It would seem beyond my physical similarity to his late wife. I was exceedingly different to her in every regard. But Morris loved me for being myself. We were on our way to my grandmother's cottage to celebrate our 2nd wedding anniversary. As my grandmother was of the opinion that all anniversaries should be celebrated with the whole family, my grandmother adored Morris like a son. She said he reminded her of her late husband. "Those two are cut out of exactly the same cloth," she told me. I had seen pictures of my late grandfather, and the likeness he shared to Morris was actually quite startling. "Morris is such a delightful man. It is so tragic how he lost his first wife, Crystal. But now he has a second chance at happiness with you, Katiana, and I can see he loves the bones off you. You have found yourself a keeper in Morris," she told me. "He is a wonderful man." "A keeper whom I initially thought was a creep," I admitted to her. "That is the huge problem with the youth of today. So quick to judge," said my grandmother, shaking her head sadly. "Honestly, you don't always assume that a book is the same as its cover. But today, that's how people look at each other. They judge each other based on their physical appearances, and they can get things so horribly wrong." My grandmother was right, of course, but that wouldn't be the first time. She was usually right about most things. I'd seen Morris peering at me when I was buying gloves from Tina at the department store. I'd thought he was a creep. And when those 2 ambiguous Bigfoots were carrying my car away from a portal, I thought they had a nefarious agenda towards me. and that 2 monsters from my childlike nightmares had come back to life, and on both counts I had been horribly wrong. I'm not sure what time it was when Morris began driving his truck down the same inauspicious stretch of forsaken road where I'd taken a nap on that night, when exhaustion had taken hold of me, and I had no choice but to resign myself to sleeping on the back seat of my car, over a little clearing of pebbles that the Bigfoots assured me was a portal of some kind. "Stop!" I told him suddenly. "Stop the car right here!" "Why?" he asked me. "Why do you want me to stop here?" "Because this is the spot where I parked my car on the day I encountered those Bigfoot that I told you about. They said I'd parked my car over a portal. They claimed this little clearing over here is actually a portal of some kind. I wanted to see if I could sense anything." "Like what?" he asked me. "I don't know," I said. "Just humour me, will you, please?" We parked our car on the edge of where the Bigfoots claimed had been a portal, and I walked over to the spot, and I kid you not, when me and my husband stood over the area, we both sensed as if the ground wanted to swallow us like quicksand. I've never experienced anything like that before or since. "Bloody hell," said my husband. "I'm getting the hell out of here. That is definitely a portal." So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.